An ancient Sumerian tablet is said to hold a secret that should be impossible. Not a king list, not a prayer, a genetic confession. The claim is startling. Thousands of years before modern biology, Mesopotamian scribes supposedly recorded why humans carry 23 pairs of chromosomes, while our closest ape relatives carry 24. One missing pair. One ancient explanation. One suggestion that humanity was not merely born, but altered. If true, it would rewrite everything we think we know about civilization, evolution, and the oldest stories ever pressed into clay. But clay is patient, and rumors are not. Before we accept a forbidden tablet as evidence, we need to slow down. We need to separate what ancient Mesopotamian texts actually say from what modern imagination has placed upon them, and ask why this particular claim feels so haunting. Tonight, we begin in the strange meeting place between science and myth. The genome on one side, the temple archive on the other. There are real mysteries here. Human chromosome 2 does carry evidence of an ancient fusion. Sumerian and Akkadian myths do speak of gods, creation, labor, clay, blood, and a deep watery realm associated with wisdom. But the bridge between those worlds is where the fog gathers. Was there ever a tablet that described genetic engineering? Did Enki, the clever god of the deep, become a scientist only in modern retellings? Or are we watching an old myth being dressed in the language of DNA? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The number is real. That is the first thing to understand before the story wanders too far into tablets, gods, and secret laboratories beneath the ancient world. Human beings do have 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, our closest living relatives among the great apes, have 48 chromosomes, arranged in 24 pairs. It is a small difference, at least on the page. 2 chromosomes, 1 pair, a slight adjustment in the inventory of the body, and yet, for anyone looking for a hidden doorway into the human origin story, that number can feel strangely charged. Why should humans be different? Why should the creature that writes poetry, builds cities, mourns its dead, maps the stars, and argues on the internet about ancient aliens carry 1 fewer chromosome pair than the apes standing closest to us on the evolutionary tree? This is where the sensational versions of the claim often begin. They point to the number 23 as if it were a signature, a mark, a deliberate edit in the biological manuscript. In those tellings, the missing pair becomes evidence that something or someone intervened, that an ancient intelligence took an earlier hominin and altered it, reducing 24 pairs to 23, leaving behind a clue in every cell. But science does not begin with the mood of a mystery. It begins with the harder, slower work of asking what the evidence actually shows. A chromosome is not a mystical unit. It is a structure, a long molecule of DNA packaged with proteins, folded and organized so that genetic information can be copied, protected, and passed from one generation to the next. If DNA is often compared to a text, chromosomes are not chapters in a neat book, so much as volumes in a complicated archive, folded, indexed, cross-referenced, repaired, and sometimes rearranged by natural processes. The number of chromosomes in a species is not a ladder of advancement. More chromosomes do not mean more complexity. Fewer chromosomes do not mean a creature is more refined. Some butterflies have hundreds. Some plants have far more than humans. Domestic horses have 64 chromosomes. Donkeys have 62. Dogs have 78. The humble potato has 48. The same total as a chimpanzee, which is a useful reminder that chromosome count is not a ranking system, however much the human ego might enjoy one. The significance of the human number is not that 46 is magical. It is significant because it differs from the pattern seen in the other great apes, and because evolutionary biology asks a very plain question. If humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor, and if our closest ape relatives have 48 chromosomes, why do we have 46? For a long time, this was not an easy question to examine. Chromosomes are visible under a microscope, but seeing them clearly enough to count and compare them required advances in cell preparation and staining techniques. The modern human chromosome count was correctly established in the 1950s. Before that, even something as basic as the number of human chromosomes had been misreported. This is worth pausing over. Not because early scientists were foolish, but because nature does not always arrange its evidence for our convenience. Even the body we live inside had to be learned carefully. Once human chromosomes could be studied with more precision, the difference between humans and other great apes became unavoidable. We had 23 pairs. They had 24. If common ancestry was true, then somewhere along the human line, one of two things had likely happened. Either an ancestral chromosome had split in the ape lineages, increasing their number, or two ancestral chromosomes had fused in the human lineage, reducing ours. The evidence points strongly to the second option. Human chromosome 2 is the key. It is unusually large, and when scientists compare it with the chromosomes of chimpanzees and other great apes, a pattern appears. Human chromosome 2 corresponds not to one ape chromosome, but to two. In chimpanzees, these are often discussed as two separate ancestral counterparts. In humans, their genetic material appears joined end to end. That phrase, joined end to end, is the quiet center of the whole matter. Chromosomes have protective structures at their ends called telomeres. They function a little like caps, helping prevent the ends of chromosomes from being mistaken for broken DNA. Chromosomes also have centromeres, regions important during cell division, when the chromosomes are pulled apart and distributed into new cells. If two ancestral chromosomes fused, scientists would expect to find certain traces, remnants of telomere-like sequences in the middle of human chromosome 2, where chromosome ends should not normally be, and signs of an old centromere that no longer functions as the primary one. Those traces exist. The deeper evidence deserves its own careful attention, because it has become one of the most cited pieces of human evolutionary genetics. But even before we dwell on the technical details, the broader implication is clear. The difference between 48 and 46 does not require a missing tablet, a lost operation, or a deliberate act of engineering. It fits a known biological mechanism, chromosomal fusion. This is where the story becomes more interesting than the myth, not less. Because a chromosomal fusion is not some trivial clerical mistake in the genome. It is a major structural change. It can affect fertility. It can influence how chromosomes pair during reproduction. In many cases, chromosomal rearrangements are harmful. In some cases, they are neutral enough to persist. Very rarely, under the right population conditions, they can spread. Imagine a small ancestral population, not yet human in the modern sense, but somewhere along the hominin line after it had begun to diverge from the lineage leading to chimpanzees. In one individual, two chromosomes fuse. That individual would still have had the genetic material, but arranged differently. The issue would not be whether the genes vanished. They did not. The issue would be whether the rearranged chromosomes could still be passed on successfully. If the individual survived and reproduced, the fused chromosome could enter the population. At first, it would be rare. Those carrying one fused chromosome and the unfused versions would have an uneven arrangement compared with those carrying only the ancestral form. But genetic history is not a perfectly tidy machine. Small populations can preserve oddities. Chance can matter. So can reproductive success. Over time, if the fusion was not severely harmful, it could become more common. Eventually, descendants could inherit two copies of the fused chromosome, creating the 23-pair pattern that all living humans carry today. This does not mean chromosome 2 fusion made us human in the grand cinematic sense. It did not suddenly produce language, art, morality, or self-awareness. Evolution does not usually work like a switch being thrown in a dark room. It is more often a long accumulation of changes: anatomical, neurological, behavioral, ecological. Some are dramatic in hindsight. Many are subtle. Most would have been invisible to the creatures living through them. This is one of the common distortions in the more exotic interpretations of chromosome 2. They take a real genetic event and inflate it into a moment of intentional transformation. The fusion becomes a kind of biological ceremony. Before it, an animal. After it, humanity. But that is not what the evidence says. The fusion is a marker in our lineage, a trace of deep ancestry, not a certificate of sudden creation. Still, the emotional power of the number should not be dismissed too quickly. The claim survives partly because it attaches itself to something genuine. If humans had the same chromosome count as chimpanzees, the story would lose one of its sharpest hooks. The difference gives speculation a foothold. It offers a measurable fact that can be placed beside an ancient myth, and from a distance the two begin to seem connected. But proximity is not proof. A true statement can be used to support an untrue conclusion. Humans have 23 chromosome pairs. Sumerian and Akkadian myths do describe divine beings involved in the creation or ordering of humanity. Those two statements can sit side by side, but there is no automatic bridge between them. The bridge has to be built from evidence, not atmosphere. And the evidence matters because the human genome is not a rumor. It can be studied, compared, sequenced. Its structures can be tested against predictions. If chromosome 2 were the result of an artificial design, that claim would need to explain why the evidence looks exactly like a natural fusion inherited through descent. It would need to show not just that humans are different, but that the difference bears marks of intervention distinct from known evolutionary mechanisms. So far, no verified ancient source provides that. No tablet has been shown to describe chromosomes. No Mesopotamian text gives a biological explanation for 23 pairs. No ancient scribe, as far as the evidence shows, recorded a hidden genetic blueprint in the language of temple myth. The real story is quieter, but it reaches further. In every human cell, there is a record of an ancient rearrangement. Not a divine signature in any demonstrable sense, not proof of a secret laboratory, but a physical trace of ancestry, one that ties us to other apes even as it marks one of the differences that set our lineage apart. The mystery, then, is not whether the number exists. It does. The question is what kind of story we are willing to build around it. To understand why the Abzu has become such fertile ground for modern speculation, we have to begin with the landscape that imagined it. Southern Mesopotamia was not a desert in the simple way we often picture it. It was a country of rivers, reeds, marshes, canals, mud brick, and difficult abundance. The Tigris and Euphrates did not merely pass through the land. They made civilization possible, and they also threatened to undo it. Water was life, but it was never fully obedient. It rose, withdrew, flooded fields, carried silt, filled canals, and vanished beneath the earth only to return through springs and seepage. For people living there, the world below was not empty. It was charged with presence. The Sumerian word Absu, later known in Akkadian as Apsu, referred to a deep freshwater realm, a hidden reservoir beneath the visible world. It was not simply a lake or a river. It was a cosmic source, a mythological deep, an unseen foundation from which fertility, wisdom, and power could emerge. In a land where irrigation meant survival, that idea was not abstract theology. It was rooted in the daily fact that water under the earth could decide whether a field lived or died. This is the first thing modern retellings often miss. The Abzu was not strange because the Sumerians were describing advanced technology in disguise. It was strange because they lived in a world where the boundary between nature, religion, and power was not divided the way we divide it now. A spring was not merely hydrology. A canal was not merely engineering. A temple was not merely architecture. These things belong to one connected order, where gods, cities, waters, kings, and labor all spoke to one another through ritual and myth. In Sumerian tradition, the Abzu is closely associated with Enki, the god of wisdom, craft, water, magic, and creation. His great cult center was Eridu, one of the oldest cities in southern Mesopotamia, and his temple there was known as the Abzu, the House of the Abzu. That name matters. It tells us that the Abzu was not only imagined as a distant cosmic region, it could also be ritually present in a temple, embodied in sacred architecture, made local and usable. The deep beneath the world had an address. From there, the story becomes more complicated, because Mesopotamian texts do not give us one clean, systematic theology. They give us layers. Sumerian hymns, temple traditions, creation stories, and later Akkadian epics preserve different images of the deep. In some accounts, the Abzu is a place of life-giving waters. In others, especially in the later Babylonian creation epic, Apsu becomes personified as a primordial being, the freshwater deep itself, paired against Tiamat, the saltwater sea. These traditions are related, but they are not identical. Ancient Mesopotamian religion was not a single handbook. It was a long conversation across cities, languages, centuries, and political worlds. That is important, because modern theories often treat the Abzu as though it were a technical term with one hidden meaning, waiting to be decoded. But the evidence does not behave that way. The Abzu is a mythic space, a divine reservoir, a sacred depth, sometimes a cosmic principle, sometimes a temple reality, sometimes a primordial figure. Its meaning shifts depending on the text and period. That does not make it meaningless. It makes it ancient. And ancient thought is rarely as tidy as modern conspiracy charts want it to be. In the more speculative versions of the Anunnaki theory, the Abzu is sometimes reimagined as an underground base, a hidden laboratory, or even a biological facility where early humans were engineered. The argument usually moves by suggestion rather than evidence. Enki is linked with wisdom and creation. The Abzu is hidden beneath the earth. Humans are formed in myth through divine action. Therefore, the Abzu must have been a secret genetic workstation. It is an alluring chain of ideas, especially if one is already looking for technological secrets buried in religious language. But each link in that chain needs to be handled carefully. Ancient texts do place Enki in relation to the Abzu. They do describe him as a god of intelligence, craftsmanship, and creative power. They do place human origins within divine narratives. What they do not do is describe microscopes, chromosomes, DNA, gene manipulation, surgical facilities, breeding chambers, or anything resembling modern biological engineering. When the Abzu appears, it appears in the language of sacred water, divine order, fertility, temple power, and cosmic structure. This does not mean the texts are simple. In fact, their complexity is exactly why they are so easy to misuse. A phrase like the deep can feel mysterious to modern ears. A god fashioning life can sound, if one wishes it to, like an experiment. A hidden domain beneath the earth can be turned into a facility with very little effort from the imagination. But the move from mythic depth to genetic laboratory is not a translation. It is an interpretation laid over the text from the outside. There is a difference between saying, the Sumerians imagined creation through divine craft, and saying, the Sumerians recorded alien biotechnology. The first statement is supported by the language and worldview of the texts. The second requires evidence the texts themselves do not provide. Still, we should not mock the instinct behind the question. It is not absurd to notice that Mesopotamian myths are fascinated by creation, hidden knowledge, and the making of human life. These are powerful themes. They continue to attract us because they sit close to the deepest uncertainties of being human. Where did consciousness come from? Why are we burdened with work? Why do we seem both animal and something more restless than animal? Ancient people asked those questions in the grammar of gods and waters. Modern people ask them in the grammar of genes and deep time. The problem begins when we collapse those grammars into one another. The Abzu belongs to a worldview in which water is not only physical but cosmic. Its hiddenness is not secrecy in the modern intelligence agency sense. It is sacred concealment. Its depth is not necessarily underground architecture. It is the unseen support of visible life. Enki does not need a laboratory to be a god of creation, because divine craft in Mesopotamian thought already carries its own power. The ancient imagination did not require stainless steel tables and coded genomes to make the origin of life feel astonishing. In some texts, Enki's relationship with the Abzu also has political and ritual meaning. A city that housed the god of deep waters could claim access to wisdom and fertility. A temple named for the Abzu could serve as a symbolic point where the human world touched the divine source. This was not trivial. In early Mesopotamian civilization, temples were economic centers, administrative centers, ritual centers, and ideological centers. To say that Enki's house was the house of the Abzu was to place sacred abundance at the heart of civic order. That makes the Abzu less like a bunker and more like a cosmic engine. Not mechanical, but symbolic. It powered authority. It explained prosperity. It gave divine depth to the management of water, labor, and survival. In a canal civilization, control over water was never just practical. It was sacred, political, and existential. There is also an irony here. The modern laboratory interpretation tries to make the Abzu more impressive by making it technological. But that may actually shrink it. A laboratory is a room where experiments happen. The Abzu was larger than that. It was the unseen freshwater foundation beneath creation, a religious answer to why the world could be fertile at all. It tied the underground, the temple, the god, and the city into one imaginative system. To read it only as a hidden facility is to replace a vast ancient cosmology with a modern movie set. What we can say with more confidence is this. The Abzu was one of the great symbolic depths of Mesopotamian religion. It carried associations of fresh water, creation, wisdom, hidden power, and divine presence. It belonged especially to Enki and to Eridu's sacred identity. It was not, in any verified text, a genetic laboratory. The evidence simply does not support that leap. But the fact that the leap keeps being made tells us something revealing. The Abzu survives in modern imagination because it sits at the perfect crossing point between myth and mystery. It is hidden, but not empty. Ancient, but not fully explained. Connected to creation, but not written in a way that satisfies modern curiosity. It gives just enough shape for speculation to gather around it. And perhaps that is why the waters beneath Mesopotamia still feel so deep, not because they conceal a lost scientific manual, but because they preserve a human way of thinking that is now difficult for us to enter. A world where water could be wisdom, where a temple could touch the primeval deep, where creation was not a solved mechanism, but a sacred tension between earth, God, labor, and life. The Abzu does not need to be a laboratory to be mysterious. It was already the place beneath the world where life began to feel possible. From the deep waters of the Abzu, one figure rises more often than any other in the modern retelling of this mystery. Enki. To the Sumerians, he was not a minor spirit hidden at the edge of the pantheon. He was one of the great divine powers of Mesopotamia, known later in Akkadian as Ea, a god of water, wisdom, magic, craft, clever speech, and creative intelligence. His home was associated with Eridu, one of the oldest cities in southern Mesopotamia, where the landscape itself seemed to invite myth-making. Marshes, reeds, canals, shining wet earth, and the uneasy border between habitable land and the watery unknown. That setting matters. Enki was not imagined in a dry, abstract heaven, far away from human life. His power belonged to the place where water made civilization possible. In southern Mesopotamia, water was not simply beautiful. It was survival, wealth, danger, and order. Too little, and fields failed. Too much, and the world drowned. A god of water was therefore also a god of knowledge, planning, engineering, and control. To manage water was to manage life itself. This is one of the reasons Enki becomes so tempting for modern theories about ancient technology. He already stands at the intersection of nature and intelligence. He is not just strong, he understands how things work. In Mesopotamian mythology, Enki is often the god who knows the hidden mechanism behind reality. He is linked with the me, those mysterious divine powers or ordinances that structure civilization. Kingship, craftsmanship, music, writing, social order, ritual, and many of the arts that turn human life from mere survival into culture. The exact nature of the me is not easy to translate. They are not machines, not laws in the modern legal sense, not simple technologies. They are more like sacred patterns of civilization, the authorized forms by which the world becomes organized. But this is precisely where modern imagination can begin to drift. If a myth says a god possesses the powers of civilization, a reader in the age of laboratories and code may begin to hear something else. Data, programs, operating systems, genetic instructions. The ancient text is speaking in the language of divine order. The modern reader, especially one searching for lost science, may translate that order into technology. Enki's personality only deepens the attraction. He is not usually portrayed as a distant thunderer or a simple king of the gods. He is clever, sometimes evasive, sometimes generous, sometimes morally complicated. He helps, tricks, negotiates, and intervenes. In several traditions, he appears as the divine problem solver, the god who finds a way around catastrophe. In the Atrahasis tradition, known from Akkadian versions, Ea plays a crucial role in preserving humanity from destruction. When the gods decide to send a flood, Ea warns Atrahasis, though the story frames the warning in a careful and indirect way. He does not always confront divine authority openly. He works through language, through cunning, through loopholes. That detail is easy to overlook, but it tells us something important. Enki's wisdom is not merely intellectual, it is tactical. He survives within systems of power by bending them. To ancient audiences, that may have made him especially compelling. In a world governed by kings, temples, weather, debt, disease, and unpredictable rivers, the idea of a divine intelligence that could quietly intervene on behalf of human beings would have carried real emotional force. Enki is not just a creator, he is a patron of survival. And this is where the later genetic engineering theories find their favorite opening. If a god is associated with creation, water, hidden knowledge, craft, and the preservation of humanity, then it is not difficult for a modern speculative writer to recast him as a scientist. His watery domain becomes an underground facility. His wisdom becomes advanced technology. His magic becomes biotechnology. His role in human origins becomes an experiment. The problem is not that this reinterpretation comes from nowhere. Myths often use images of making, shaping, mixing, and animating. Mesopotamian creation stories do speak about divine beings involved in the formation of humans. They do connect humanity's beginning with clay, blood, labor, and the decisions of the gods. Enki or Ea is often nearby when questions of life, order, and human destiny appear. But being nearby is not the same as holding a genetic instrument. The ancient texts do not describe chromosomes. They do not describe DNA. They do not describe gene transfer, cell nuclei, reproductive isolation, or anything comparable to a laboratory procedure in the modern biological sense. What they describe is mythic creation within a religious universe. The gods debate. They suffer burdens. They seek relief. They use materials that carry symbolic meaning. Clay is the human substance of the earth. Divine blood or essence marks a connection between humanity and the gods. Labor explains the human condition. The story is not trying to provide a medical diagram. That distinction is not a dismissal of the myths. In fact, it makes them more interesting. If we reduce Enki to an alien geneticist, we may think we are making the story more exciting, but we are also making it smaller. We flatten a god of wisdom, water, ritual, craftsmanship, magic, social order, and moral ambiguity into a single modern role: technician. Ancient Mesopotamian religion did not separate categories the way modern thought often does. What we call magic, religion, medicine, politics, engineering, and literature could overlap. A ritual expert might use incantations, herbs, purified water, and inherited formulas. A king might build canals under divine authority. A temple might function as a religious, economic, and administrative center. Creation itself could be imagined as an act of divine craftsmanship. To call Enki a god of craft does not mean he was believed to operate a machine in the modern sense. It means creation was understood through the forms of skill that ancient people knew: shaping clay, directing water, speaking powerful words, establishing order. There is also a subtle difference between intelligence and technology. Enki's wisdom is often portrayed as knowing the proper order of things, the hidden names, the correct ritual, the clever solution. It is not necessarily a knowledge of material mechanisms in the way a geneticist understands a chromosome. Modern readers tend to assume that superior knowledge must look like advanced science. Ancient texts often imagine superior knowledge as access to divine patterns, secret words, sacred measures, and the right relationship between beings. That difference matters because it changes the entire question. If we ask, did Enki create humans? The answer depends on which myth we are reading and how broadly we frame divine participation. In some traditions, Enki or Ea is involved in plans surrounding human creation. In others, different deities carry out the shaping. Mesopotamian mythology is not a single fixed book with one official timeline. It is a long, layered collection of Sumerian and Akkadian stories, copied, adapted, reworked, and preserved across centuries. The gods change names, roles overlap, and themes migrate. If we ask, did Enki genetically engineer humans? The evidence becomes much thinner. That claim requires more than a myth of divine creation. It requires language or material evidence pointing toward biological intervention. And that is where the ancient astronaut reading moves beyond the texts. Still, we should understand why Enki became the chosen figure. He is almost too perfect for the role assigned to him by modern speculation. He lives in the deep. He possesses hidden wisdom. He is linked to human creation and protection. He is not merely powerful, but inventive. He can be imagined as compassionate toward humans, or at least more sympathetic than some of the harsher divine authorities in the stories. For anyone trying to build a narrative of ancient intervention, Enki is far more useful than a storm god swinging a weapon across the sky. There is an emotional logic here. People are drawn to Enki because he feels like the god who might know the secret. Not the loud secret, the buried one. The kind hidden under myth, under water, under a name that changed from language to language. But careful investigation asks us to hold two truths at once. Enki is genuinely one of the most fascinating creator figures in the ancient world. And the modern image of Enki as a genetic engineer is not something the known Mesopotamian texts plainly state. It is a later construction, built from fragments that have been rearranged under the pressure of modern questions. The older Enki does not need a laboratory to matter. His power lies in the way ancient people imagined intelligence itself: fluid, dangerous, generous, and difficult to control. He represents the hope that somewhere beneath the visible world there is a deeper order, and that wisdom consists in learning how to approach it without being destroyed by it. That may be why his image has survived so easily into our own time. We still look at human origins and feel that something is hidden there. We still search for the maker's hand, whether in clay, in myth, or in the long-coiled script of the genome. To understand why the genetic engineering theory found such fertile ground, we have to stand for a while inside one of the oldest human stories ever written down. Not a story of laboratories, not chromosomes, not sterile instruments under bright glass light, but clay, blood, exhaustion, and the unbearable weight of work. In the Mesopotamian imagination, humanity was not created because the universe felt incomplete without us. That is one of the first details that unsettles modern readers. We are used to origin stories that place human beings near the emotional center of creation, as beloved children, chosen witnesses, or the final masterpiece of a divine plan. But in several Mesopotamian traditions, the first humans appear for a far more practical reason. The gods are tired. In the Atrahasis epic, preserved in Akkadian and known from tablets copied over many centuries, the younger gods are burdened with labor. They dig canals. They maintain the irrigation works. They perform the heavy tasks that made life possible in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. This was not a minor image. In a land where agriculture depended on controlling water, canal labor was civilization itself. To dig, clear, dredge, and repair channels was to keep hunger away. It was also backbreaking. The myth imagines the gods doing this work before humans existed, and eventually they rebel. That rebellion is not usually presented like a grand war between cosmic good and evil. It feels more like a labor crisis written in divine language. The workers have had enough. Their tools become symbols of refusal. The noise reaches the higher gods. A problem has to be solved. And the solution is us. This is where the story becomes so powerful and also so easy to misread. In the Atrahasis tradition, the gods decide to create a new being who will carry the workload. A mother goddess, often called Mami or Nintu, in different versions and related traditions, is involved in the making of humanity. Enki, or Ea in Akkadian, the clever god of wisdom and craft, plays a guiding role. The materials are striking: clay and something taken from a slain god. Depending on the version, the divine figure sacrificed may be named Ailu, or given another name in related traditions. The details vary, and the tablets themselves are not always complete. But the core image is memorable enough to survive the damage of time. Clay is mixed with a divine substance, often blood or flesh, and from that mixture humans are fashioned. It is not difficult to see why modern writers interested in ancient astronauts or genetic manipulation became fascinated by this passage. Clay sounds like raw biological material. Blood sounds like hereditary information. A god's essence mixed into an earthly substance can be made to resemble the insertion of superior DNA into a primitive organism. A mother goddess shaping the new creature can be recast as a kind of ancient genetic technician. Enki, already associated with wisdom, hidden knowledge, and creation, becomes in this reading not a deity of myth, but the director of a biological project. The problem is not that the imagery is weak. The imagery is extremely strong. The problem is that strength is not the same as evidence. In the world of the text, clay is not an accidental choice. Mesopotamia was a civilization built from clay. Houses were made from mud brick. Tablets were made from clay. Seals pressed authority into clay. The river plains themselves offered clay as one of the basic substances of ordered life. To say that humans were made from clay was not a clumsy attempt to describe cells or organic chemistry. It was a way of saying that humans belonged to the earth, to the worked soil, to the fragile and shaped material of the world they inhabited. Clay could be formed, but it could also break. That matters. A human being in these myths is not immortal spirit trapped in matter. A human being is a molded creature, useful and vulnerable, animated by something beyond ordinary earth, but still bound to decay. The clay tells us about human status. The blood tells us something different. The blood or flesh of the slain god gives humanity a divine component, but not necessarily a glamorous one. It is not presented as a gift that makes humans equal to gods. It is closer to a burden or an inheritance of restless vitality. In some interpretations, the divine element gives humans intelligence, breath, or spirit. In others, it explains why humans can serve the gods properly, why they can understand ritual obligation, why they are more than animals, yet still less than divine. There is also a darker possibility in the symbolism. If humanity is made from the remains of a god killed to resolve a labor dispute, then human existence begins with violence absorbed into flesh. The first people are not simply born. They are produced out of a compromise after revolt. We carry in this mythic language the memory of conflict between work and authority. That idea is easy to miss if we rush too quickly toward modern biology. The myth is not just asking, where did humans come from? It is also asking, why do humans have to work? That question would have been painfully immediate in an agricultural society organized around fields, canals, temples, and royal projects. The daily world of ancient Mesopotamia was not an abstract stage for theology. It was a place of grain rations, tax obligations, irrigation schedules, and bodies bent under heat. So when the myth says humans were created to relieve the gods of labor, it is making sense of a social reality. Work is not merely economic, it is cosmic. The farmer, the canal digger, the brewer, the baker, the temple servant, all are participating in an order that reaches beyond human society. To feed the gods through offerings, to maintain temples, to sustain the land, was to keep the world functioning. Modern readers often hear that and imagine simple oppression. Humans invented as slaves. There is truth in that harshness, but it is not the whole texture. In Mesopotamian religion, service to the gods could be burdensome and meaningful at the same time. The gods needed food, houses, songs, and rituals. Humans needed divine favor, rainfall, fertility, and protection from chaos. The relationship was unequal, but not meaningless. It was a system of dependency imagined on a cosmic scale. That is why the creation of humans from clay and divine blood cannot be reduced to a primitive memory of a laboratory procedure. The myth is doing too many other things. It explains labor. It explains mortality. It explains why humans possess a spark of intelligence while remaining physically weak compared with the gods. It explains why rituals matter. It explains why civilization itself feels like both a blessing and a sentence. There are related Mesopotamian traditions that deepen this picture. In the Babylonian creation epic, often called Enuma Elish, humanity is fashioned from the blood of Kingu, a defeated divine rebel, so that humans may perform service for the gods. Here again, divine blood is involved. But the theological emphasis is not on genetics. It is on victory, order, and the redistribution of labor after cosmic conflict. The defeated power becomes the material from which servants of the new divine order are made. In the Sumerian composition often known as Enki and Ninmah, Creation is connected to clay and the birth goddess. The story includes unusual, even strange scenes of forming human bodies and assigning social places to beings who are made imperfectly. It is sometimes pulled into arguments about experimentation, as if the text were describing failed biological prototypes. But read within its own world, it speaks more naturally to divine craftsmanship, fate, bodily difference, and the organization of society. The ancient story is not embarrassed by imperfect bodies. It tries to place them within a sacred order, however uncomfortable that order may feel to us now. This is one of the places where caution matters. Ancient myths are not technical manuals, but they are not nonsense either. They speak in symbols that were precise within their own culture. Clay is not just clay. Blood is not just blood. A womb goddess is not merely a metaphor without weight. These images carry religious and social meaning. The mistake comes when we translate symbolic precision into technological precision. A modern person sees blood and thinks of DNA, inheritance, genetic coding. That is understandable, because genetics has become one of our dominant languages for identity. We say things are in the blood, even when we do not mean it literally. But Mesopotamian scribes did not possess a concept of DNA hidden inside blood cells. They did not describe chromosomes, base pairs, gene sequences, or reproductive engineering. To insert those ideas into the text requires a leap, and the leap usually tells us more about modern imagination than ancient knowledge. Still, the attraction is worth taking seriously. These myths endure because they make humanity feel designed and compromised at once. We are made from earth, but not only earth. We are close to animals, yet somehow troubled by gods. We build cities, write laws, bury our dead, measure the stars, and then spend half our lives doing tasks we did not choose. If someone comes along and says, perhaps the ancients were remembering an intervention, the idea hooks into a very old discomfort. The sense that human beings are oddly fitted to the world, brilliant and burdened in the same breath. But the Atrahasis epic does not need gene-splicing to be disturbing. Its power lies in the plainness of its claim. Humanity begins as a solution to someone else's exhaustion. Our intelligence is not a crown placed gently on the head of creation. It is part of a work arrangement. Our divine ingredient does not free us from labor. It binds us to it. That may be why the story still feels strangely modern. Strip away the gods, and the question remains familiar. Who carries the weight that keeps the world running? Who benefits from that labor? Who tells the workers that their burden is sacred? The ancient tablets do not answer those questions in the language of modern politics or biology. They answer with clay pressed by hands, with divine blood mixed into matter, with gods negotiating over the cost of civilization. And somewhere in that mixture, the first humans open their eyes, not as laboratory products in any verified ancient account, but as mythic beings made to stand between soil and heaven, carrying a burden older than history. The strange thing about the Anunnaki theory is that it did not really begin in ancient Mesopotamia. It began much later, in the modern imagination, in museum galleries, translated tablets, paperback books, television specials, and the long afterglow of the space age. It was born in a world where rockets had already left Earth, where the moon was no longer a symbol but a place humans had physically touched, and where ancient ruins suddenly seemed to some people less like remnants of human civilization and more like possible landing sites. That timing matters, because when people today hear the word Anunnaki, they often imagine towering visitors from another world, technologically advanced beings descending from the sky, mining gold, altering early humans, and leaving behind clues in myth. But in the ancient Mesopotamian sources themselves, the Anunnaki are not presented in that way. They are divine beings within a religious universe, powerful, hierarchical, sometimes mysterious, but still part of the mythic and cultic world of Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria. The transformation from group of gods into extraterrestrial engineers is not something the clay tablets plainly say. It is something that happened after those tablets were excavated, translated, reinterpreted, and then folded into a much newer story about humanity's origins. To understand how that happened, we have to step away from the temples of ancient Sumer for a moment and enter a different kind of landscape. The 20th century, with its anxieties, its technologies, and its appetite for forbidden explanations. The ancient astronaut idea did not appear out of nowhere. By the mid-20th century, there was already a growing fascination with the possibility that ancient monuments and myths preserved memories of contact with beings from beyond Earth. Some writers argued that the pyramids, the Nazca lines, megalithic sites, and biblical visions might be misunderstood evidence of advanced visitors. These claims were rarely accepted by archaeologists, but they found an eager audience. Part of the appeal was visual. A carved figure with a strange helmet, a mythic chariot in the sky, a god descending from heaven. Once the modern mind has seen astronauts and spacecraft, it becomes tempting to see them everywhere. The past begins to look less like the past and more like a coded version of the future. This is where the Anunnaki entered modern popular mythology. The most influential figure in shaping the extraterrestrial Anunnaki narrative was Zecharia Sitchin, whose book The 12th Planet appeared in 1976. Sitchin argued that ancient Mesopotamian texts described not merely gods, but beings from another planet, often associated in his work with a celestial body called Nibiru. In his version of the story, these beings came to Earth, needed laborers, and engineered humans through intervention in earlier hominins. It was a sweeping narrative. It connected Sumerian gods, planetary astronomy, gold mining, human origins, and ancient myth into one vast alternative history. It had the feel of revelation, the suggestion that ordinary translations had missed the real story, that the world's oldest writings contained a suppressed memory of alien contact. But this is exactly where caution becomes essential. Sitchin's readings are not accepted by mainstream Assyriologists or Sumerologists. Specialists in Mesopotamian languages have long disputed his translations, his interpretations of key terms, and his reconstruction of ancient cosmology. The problem is not merely that his conclusions are bold. Bold conclusions can sometimes be valuable. The deeper issue is that the linguistic and textual foundation does not support the structure built upon it. In ancient Mesopotamian texts, the word Anunnaki does not consistently describe one fixed group with one fixed role. Its meaning shifts across periods, languages, and genres. Sometimes the Anunnaki are associated with major gods. Sometimes they appear in underworld contexts. Sometimes they are invoked as divine judges or collective powers. Mesopotamian religion was not a single tidy doctrine. It changed across centuries, cities, dynasties, and scribal traditions. Modern theories often flatten that complexity. They take a word from a living, changing religious system and make it behave like the name of a single extraterrestrial species with a consistent mission plan. That may make for a cleaner story, but ancient mythology is rarely clean in that way. There is also a subtler problem. Ancient myths often describe gods creating humans, assigning labor, controlling destinies, and possessing knowledge beyond human reach. To a modern reader, especially one familiar with genetic engineering, these ideas can seem almost technological. Creation from clay becomes biological fabrication. Divine essence becomes DNA. The house of a god becomes a laboratory. The labor of humanity becomes a designed workforce. But resemblance is not evidence. Human beings have always used the language available to them to explain existence. Agricultural societies imagined creation through earth, water, breath, blood, seed, craft, and command. These were not random images. They came from the materials of daily life. Potters shaping clay, farmers irrigating fields, rulers assigning labor, priests serving gods. When a Mesopotamian text says humans were made to bear work that the gods no longer wished to carry, it is speaking directly to a world of canals, temples, grain, obligation, and hierarchy. The modern Anunnaki theory takes that ancient social imagination and translates it into the language of laboratories and genetic design. The result is compelling because it feels like decoding, but it may tell us more about modern expectations than ancient belief. Still, it would be too easy, and not quite honest, to dismiss the theory simply as foolishness. Its endurance reveals something important. The Anunnaki theory grew in the space between real discoveries and speculative leaps. Real tablets were excavated. Real myths were translated. Real questions exist about human evolution, ancient astronomy, and the sophistication of early civilizations. Mesopotamia really was one of the great centers of writing, mathematics, law, kingship, and cosmology. The Sumerians and their successors did preserve astonishingly complex ideas on clay. None of that needs exaggeration to be impressive. But when genuine wonder meets incomplete understanding, the border between interpretation and invention can become thin. The public often encounters ancient texts through fragments. A translated line here, a dramatic claim there, an image removed from context. A phrase like, "those who came down from heaven," depending on the language, the text, and the deity involved, can be pulled into a technological frame. A mythic descent becomes a landing. A divine assembly becomes a command structure. A sacred mountain becomes a launch site. The shift can happen almost invisibly because the modern story is already waiting to receive the ancient words. And once that story exists, it begins to feed itself. Television documentaries, internet forums, social media videos, and speculative books repeat the same cluster of claims until they feel familiar. Familiarity can be mistaken for evidence. A viewer hears that the Sumerians said the Anunnaki engineered humans so many times that the sentence begins to sound like a known fact rather than a modern interpretation layered over ancient material. This is one reason the theory has become so difficult to untangle. It is not a single claim. It is a collage. Some pieces come from Mesopotamian myth. Some come from modern evolutionary science. Some come from mistranslation or selective quotation. Some come from science fiction. Some come from an understandable suspicion that official history may be incomplete. Together, they form a story that feels larger than any one piece of evidence. But a powerful story is not the same as a well-supported one. What scholars can say with confidence is that the Anunnaki belong to Mesopotamian religious thought. They are part of a divine world concerned with authority, fate, cosmic order, death, kingship, and human service. What scholars cannot honestly derive from the known tablets is a clear account of extraterrestrial visitors genetically modifying early humans. That claim requires much more than mythic language. It would require unmistakable textual evidence, archaeological traces, biological anomalies, or some convergence of data that points beyond ordinary ancient religion and natural human evolution. So far, that evidence has not appeared, and yet, the theory's popularity is understandable. It offers a dramatic answer to a very old discomfort. Why are we like this? Why are humans so intelligent, restless, burdened, inventive, and dissatisfied? Why do we build cities and myths, wage wars and write poems, study the stars and fear death? The Anunnaki theory turns that unease into a plot. It says, "You feel unfinished because you were altered. You serve systems you did not choose because you were made to serve. You look to the sky because your makers came from there." That is not a scholarly conclusion, but as a modern myth, it has power. The irony is that ancient Mesopotamian myth was already asking similar questions, only in its own language. It did not need spacecraft to wonder why humans labor. It did not need DNA to imagine a divine ingredient in human life. It did not need alien overseers to describe a universe in which people lived under forces greater than themselves. The birth of the Anunnaki theory, then, is not the recovery of a hidden Sumerian science. It is the creation of a modern origin myth using ancient names. It reflects our age as much as theirs, our faith in technology, our distrust of institutions, our fascination with genetics, and our longing for a secret explanation behind the ordinary facts of being human. And that is why the next question becomes so important. If the theory depends on ancient tablets, then the tablets themselves must be examined carefully, not as props in a modern mystery, but as evidence. The strange thing about the so-called Sumerian chromosome tablet is not that it is hard to interpret. It is that it cannot be found. Not in the great published collections of Mesopotamian texts, not in the standard translations used by Assyriologists, not with a museum number that can be checked, not with a photograph, a line drawing, a transliteration, or even a stable ancient title. It appears instead in the modern fog where fragments of real myth drift together with half-remembered science, internet repetition, and the seductive promise that somewhere, on a piece of fired clay, the secret of human engineering was written down thousands of years before genetics had a name. And that absence matters, because cuneiform tablets are not vague relics floating outside history. When a tablet is real and studied, it usually leaves a trail. There may be an excavation record, a museum accession number, a published copy of the signs, a transliteration into Latin characters, a translation, commentary, debate over difficult words, and comparison with parallel texts. Scholars may argue fiercely about meaning, dating, genre, or damaged lines, but the object itself can normally be located within a chain of evidence. The alleged chromosome tablet has no such chain. What usually circulates is not an ancient text, but a modern claim about an ancient text. The claim says that the Sumerians, or sometimes the Anunnaki, knew that human beings possess 23 pairs of chromosomes. It may say they altered Homo erectus, It may say Enki supervised a biological project in the Abzu. It may say the gods fused two ape chromosomes to create the human line. But when the claim is pressed for the actual tablet, the ground begins to give way. A title is not enough. A dramatic paraphrase is not enough. A modern author's summary is not the same as a translation from Sumerian or Akkadian. And a sentence that sounds ancient because it uses words like clay, seed, blood, or fashioning is not automatically a genetic document in disguise. This is where the investigation becomes less glamorous, but far more important. Ancient Mesopotamian texts do contain stories of human creation. They do speak of gods shaping human beings. They do imagine divine substances, clay, blood, breath, wisdom, and labor woven into the first humans. But these texts belong to a mythological world, not a laboratory notebook. Their language is symbolic, ritual, theological, and social. It is concerned with why humans work, why gods receive offerings, why kings rule, why suffering exists, and why life seems to carry both earthly heaviness and something touched by the divine. Modern genetic language is different in kind. Chromosomes are not a poetic way of saying destiny. DNA is not simply another word for seed. Gene-splicing is not the same as mixing clay and divine blood. Homo erectus is not a category that ancient scribes could have named because it belongs to a scientific framework built from fossils, comparative anatomy, and evolutionary theory many millennia later. This does not mean ancient people were unintelligent. That is one of the mistakes on both sides of the argument. Skeptics can sometimes sound as though ancient myth is primitive confusion. Believers can sometimes respond by turning every myth into hidden technology. Both reactions flatten the ancient world. Mesopotamian scribes were subtle, disciplined, highly trained thinkers. They preserved complex lists, legal documents, hymns, omens, rituals, mathematics, astronomical observations, royal inscriptions, and literary compositions. Their intellectual culture deserves respect. But respect does not require pretending they wrote about chromosomes. If a Sumerian or Akkadian tablet explicitly described something like human genetic design, the evidence would be extraordinary. We would expect to see terms that, even if metaphorical, behaved consistently like biological technical language. We would expect a text that clearly distinguishes inherited traits, anatomical transmission, or controlled alteration of offspring in a way not already explained by mythic creation imagery. We would expect a known object, readable signs, a published edition, and serious debate among specialists. We would expect, at minimum, something that can be examined rather than merely repeated. Instead, the argument often depends on retrofitting. Retrofitting is a quiet trick of interpretation. It begins with a modern fact, then searches backward for ancient words that can be made to resemble it. A myth says humans were made from clay, and clay becomes biological substrate. A god associated with wisdom becomes a scientist. A sacred freshwater deep becomes an underground genetics facility. Divine blood becomes engineered DNA. The creation of workers becomes a labor program for extraterrestrial miners. Each step feels small while you are taking it. From a distance, the journey is enormous. The danger is not imagination itself. Imagination is useful. It lets us ask fresh questions and notice patterns that a colder reading might miss. The problem comes when imagination is allowed to replace control. Ancient words have contexts. They appear in sentences, genres, traditions, scribal schools, ritual settings, and theological systems. A single phrase cannot be lifted out of that world and made to confess a modern theory simply because it sounds suggestive in translation. Translation, especially, is one of the places where the myth grows larger. Most viewers encountering these claims are not reading Sumerian signs from photographs of tablets. They are reading English renderings, often several steps removed from the original. A term may be translated as create, fashion, make, form, or bring forth, and each English choice carries a different emotional temperature. Fashioned from clay sounds ancient and religious. Genetically engineered from material sounds technological. But the second phrase is not hidden inside the first, unless the language and context support it. And with the chromosome claim, the support is not there. There is no verified Sumerian or Akkadian tablet that states humans have 23 chromosome pairs. There is no known Mesopotamian text that describes DNA. There is no cuneiform passage naming Homo erectus. There is no ancient line explaining that two ancestral ape chromosomes fused to form human chromosome 2. There is no text in which Enki, Ea, or the Anunnaki are shown performing gene-splicing in the biological sense used by modern science. That last phrase matters. In the biological sense. Ancient creation stories do involve mixing. They involve crafting. They involve divine substances being joined to earthly matter. But mixing in myth is not automatically genetic engineering. A potter mixing clay and water is not describing polymerase chain reactions. A priest speaking of blood and life is not mapping a genome. A myth in which gods create servants is not secretly a research protocol. The more careful question is why these stories are so easy to modernize. Part of the reason is that Mesopotamian myth already contains themes that feel strangely compatible with modern anxieties. Creation is not always gentle. Human beings are made for labor. The gods are powerful, but not always morally comforting. Wisdom is guarded. Knowledge can be dangerous. Divine beings intervene in human destiny. These are fertile themes for a technological age. When modern readers bring fears of manipulation, artificial intelligence, genetic editing, and hidden elites into the ancient texts, the myths seem to answer back in our own language. But that is not necessarily the voice of Sumer. It may be our own reflection, sharpened by clay. There is also the problem of the missing original. A real ancient text can surprise us. It can resist our expectations. It can contain awkward details that do not fit a theory. A missing tablet, by contrast, is perfectly obedient. It can say exactly what the theory needs it to say. Because no one can check the line breaks, the damaged signs, the grammar, or the surrounding passage. That is why unverifiable sources are so powerful in fringe history. They offer the authority of antiquity without the inconvenience of evidence. This does not mean every person attracted to the theory is careless. Many are responding to genuine mysteries. Human origins are profound. Chromosome 2 is fascinating. Non-coding DNA is complex. The sudden emotional force of seeing myth and genetics placed side by side can be hard to dismiss. There is a real human hunger here. To discover that our oldest stories preserved something science is only now beginning to decode. But a hunger is not a tablet. What we can say with confidence is narrower and more interesting than it first appears. Mesopotamian scribes preserved creation traditions in which gods make humans from earthly and divine materials to take on labor. Modern genetics has discovered that humans differ from other great apes in chromosome number, because of a fusion event in our evolutionary past. Later writers and internet theories have placed these two facts beside one another and proposed a hidden connection. The connection, however, is not found in a verified ancient document. It is built in the modern interpretation. The missing tablet problem is therefore not a minor inconvenience. It is the central weakness of the claim. Without an actual text, there is no ancient testimony to evaluate, only a story about a story. And once we understand that, the mystery changes shape. The question is no longer, what did the Sumerians know about chromosomes? It becomes, why do we keep needing them to know? That question may not lead us to a secret laboratory beneath the waters, but it does lead somewhere revealing, into the way modern people use ancient myths to explain the uneasy feeling that humanity is both natural and strange, animal and symbolic, made of biology yet haunted by meaning. The tablet that should prove the theory is missing. The desire for it is very real. If the modern legend needs a victim or a canvas, it often chooses Homo erectus. In the more elaborate versions of the Anunnaki story, this ancient human relative becomes something like unfinished clay, a strong, primitive creature waiting in the background of prehistory until a superior intelligence arrives, with tools no one has ever found, procedures no tablet describes, and intentions that sound suspiciously modern. Homo erectus is treated as a biological rough draft, useful but incomplete, close enough to us to be modified, distant enough to be imagined however the theory requires. But the real Homo erectus is more interesting than that, not because it proves a hidden intervention, but because it does the opposite. It reminds us that human origins were not a single dramatic moment, not a sudden switch thrown in the dark, not one creature becoming another overnight. They were a long, uneven, deeply physical process, written across bones, tools, landscapes, migrations, extinctions, and surviving traces of behavior. Homo erectus appears in the fossil record roughly 1.9 million years ago, though the exact boundaries are debated, as they often are in paleoanthropology. The name itself means upright man, and that older label can be misleading because upright walking did not begin with Homo erectus. Earlier hominins were already walking on two legs. What made Homo erectus stand out was not simply posture, but a whole pattern of change. Longer legs, a more human-like body plan, a larger brain than earlier forms, and an ability to move through environments with a persistence that, even now, feels quietly astonishing. This was not a fragile creature, confined to one valley. Fossils associated with Homo erectus, or closely related forms, have been found across a vast geographical range. In Africa, remains from sites such as those in East Africa show an early presence. At Dmanisi, in what is now Georgia, hominin fossils dating to around 1.8 million years ago suggest an early expansion out of Africa, and they complicate tidy models of what a migrating human ancestor was supposed to look like. In Indonesia, the famous Java fossils helped shape the original idea of Homo erectus in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In China, sites such as Zhukudian became central to the story of Peking man, though the history of those fossils is tangled by war, loss, and reconstruction from casts and records. Already, the picture is not simple. It is not one neat species marching across the world in a straight line, carrying the future on its back. Some researchers distinguish African forms as Homo ergaster, while reserving Homo erectus more narrowly for Asian populations. Others use Homo erectus more broadly, as a wide and variable species spread across continents and hundreds of thousands of years. This is not just academic hair-splitting. It matters because when people speak as if Homo erectus were a single fixed thing, frozen in time, they erase the very evidence that makes the human story so difficult and so compelling. A fossil jaw, a skull cap, a thigh bone, a stone tool, each gives only a partial answer. Paleoanthropology is a discipline built from fragments, but those fragments do not point to emptiness. They point to populations adapting, branching, surviving, and sometimes disappearing. The old image of Homo erectus as a brutish, almost human, has not aged well. The species had a brain larger than earlier hominins, though still generally smaller than that of modern humans. Cranial capacity varied widely, often roughly in the range of about 600 to over 1,000 cubic centimeters across different specimens and times. The skull tended to be long and low, with pronounced brow ridges and thick cranial bones. The face and teeth show changes from earlier ancestors, and the body below the neck could be strikingly human-like in proportion. Long legs suggest efficient walking, perhaps long-distance travel. This was a body built not merely to exist, but to move, and movement changes everything. A creature that can travel can follow food, escape local pressures, occupy new climates, and meet new challenges. The expansion of Homo erectus into Eurasia was not a minor footnote. It suggests behavioral flexibility. It suggests endurance. It suggests that long before cities, kings, temples, writing, or myths of divine craftsmen, members of the human family were already becoming planetary in their reach. This is where the ancient engineering narrative often narrows the story too quickly. It looks at the gap between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, sees difference, and imagines a deliberate upgrade. But evolution does not require every difference to be explained by intervention. It works through inheritance, variation, selection, drift, isolation, interbreeding, and time. Especially time. The scale is hard to feel because human intuition is not built for millions of years. We understand a lifetime. We can almost understand a dynasty. But a million years is not a long hallway with a door at the end. It is an ocean of generations. Homo erectus existed for an extraordinary span. Depending on which fossils are included and how late survival dates are interpreted, populations related to Homo erectus may have persisted for well over 1 million years, possibly much longer in parts of Asia. Some late dates, particularly from Java, have been discussed intensely, with estimates placing the last known populations perhaps around 117,000 to 108,000 years ago, though interpretations of late survival remain tied to dating methods and site contexts. What matters for our investigation is not to force one exact endpoint, but to recognize the duration. This was not a brief transitional mistake. Homo erectus was successful. Successful, however, does not mean destined to become us in a simple ladder of progress. That is another misconception, quieter than the alien theories but just as distorting. Human evolution is often drawn like a staircase. Ape-like ancestor, then Homo erectus, then Neanderthal, then modern human, each step more refined than the last. Real evolution looks less like a staircase and more like a river delta, branching, rejoining, drying out in places, carving new channels where conditions allow. Homo erectus may have contributed to the ancestry of later humans, especially if we use the term broadly for early Homo populations. but the exact relationships among Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens are complex and still debated. That complexity is not a weakness in the evidence. It is what honest evidence looks like when it comes from deep time. Stone tools add another layer, but not an easy one. Homo erectus is often associated with Acheulean technology, the hand axe tradition that appears in Africa around 1.7 million years ago and later spreads widely. These tools, especially well-shaped hand axes, can look strangely deliberate to modern eyes. They suggest planning, learned skill, and repeated patterns of making. Yet the archaeological record is uneven. Acheulean tools are not found everywhere Homo erectus or related populations lived. In East Asia, for example, older tool traditions often look different, and scholars have long debated whether this reflects raw materials, cultural transmission, population history, preservation, or simply our incomplete record. So even here, where the temptation is to say technology advanced, the truth resists a clean slogan. Toolmaking was not a single universal package. It varied. It moved. It may have been lost, reinvented, adapted, or constrained by landscape and material. That sounds less like a secret laboratory program and more like culture in its earliest, roughest form, not culture as literature or law, but as repeated knowledge carried in hands. Fire is another point where caution matters. There is evidence for the use of fire by ancient humans, but the timing and degree of control are debated. Some sites suggest possible early fire use. Stronger evidence becomes clearer later. It is tempting to imagine Homo erectus gathered nightly around flames, speaking in gestures and half-words, already halfway to mythology. Perhaps sometimes that happened. Perhaps often it did not. The evidence cannot support every image we would like to place there. But even the possibility of managed fire matters, because fire changes diet, safety, movement, and social life. It turns night from pure danger into a negotiable space. Still, no matter how much we grant Homo erectus, movement, tools, possible fire use, endurance, we do not arrive at the creature described in modern speculative theories. We do not find a passive animal waiting to be engineered. We find an active participant in evolution, a population, or set of populations, already shaped by adaptation and capable of shaping its own surroundings in limited but meaningful ways. This distinction is important. The ancient astronaut version often imagines intelligence as something delivered from outside, as if the spark of humanity could only have arrived as a gift, an experiment, or a violation. But the fossil record suggests something slower and, in a way, more unsettling. Intelligence did not descend fully formed. It accumulated. It was paid for in childbirth difficulty, childhood dependency, caloric demand, social complexity, risk, and failure. Bigger brains are not free. Tool use is not magic. Migration is not romance when the landscape is dry, cold, unfamiliar, or full of predators. The deep human line is not a tale of sudden perfection. It is a record of trade-offs, and that may be why Homo erectus is so often misunderstood. It sits at an uncomfortable distance from us, too human to be dismissed as merely animal, too different to be embraced as ourselves. Its face, reconstructed in museums, can feel both familiar and remote. The brow is heavy, the skull low, the gaze speculative because, of course, the soft tissue is gone and the mind behind it is beyond recovery. We look at Homo erectus and feel the urge to decide ancestor, cousin, primitive, almost human, missing link. But missing link is one of those phrases that has done more harm than good. It implies that evolution is a chain, and that we are simply searching for the one absent piece that connects beast to man. In reality, fossils do not form a chain. They form a pattern. Some parts are dense, others are nearly blank. New discoveries do not just fill gaps. Sometimes they rearrange the entire map. So when a theory claims that Homo erectus was selected, modified, and transformed into modern humans by outside beings, we have to ask what evidence would actually support that. Not just a mythic phrase about clay. Not just a gap in public understanding. Not just the eerie fact that our chromosome count differs from that of other great apes. We would expect biological traces that do not fit inheritance. We would expect archaeological discontinuities that cannot be explained by known processes. We would expect a convergence of genetics, fossils, tools, and dated contexts, pointing in the same strange direction. Instead, what we have is messy continuity. Not perfect continuity, not a finished story, but enough to show that Homo erectus belongs within a natural history of human emergence, not outside it as an abandoned prototype. There are mysteries here, real ones. How many migrations out of Africa occurred? Which populations gave rise to later humans? How should we classify the variation among early Homo fossils? How much behavior can be inferred from tools alone? What did Homo erectus understand of death, kinship, danger, memory? These questions are difficult precisely because they are grounded in evidence, not because evidence is absent. The deeper we follow the human line, the less it resembles a clean origin myth. It becomes stranger than that. A long experiment with no experimenter. A branching inheritance with no architect standing above it. And in that long record, Homo erectus is not a blank page. It is one of the oldest chapters written in bone. Before we can judge the claim that ancient beings engineered humanity, we have to slow down and ask what that claim actually requires. Because gene-splicing is one of those modern phrases that sounds simple from a distance. It has the clean, sharp feeling of a laboratory word. A cut here, a joining there, a hidden hand rearranging the code of life. In popular retellings of the Anunnaki theory, it often becomes almost magical. A godlike intelligence takes an earlier human form, opens the biological blueprint, inserts something new, and produces us. But real genetics is less theatrical and much more demanding. A living body is not built from a single switch. It is built from layers of instruction, regulation, timing, chemistry, accident, inheritance, and repair. DNA is often described as a code, and that metaphor is useful, but it can also mislead. A code can sound like something written in neat lines, waiting for a clever editor. In reality, DNA exists inside cells, folded and packed, copied and repaired, turned on and off in different tissues at different times. It is not a stone tablet with a clean inscription. It is more like a library, a workshop, a set of traffic signals, and a damaged archive all operating at once. At the smallest level, DNA is made from chemical units arranged in long sequences. Certain stretches of those sequences are genes, which can help produce proteins or functional molecules. But genes do not act alone. They are surrounded by regulatory regions, structural regions, repeating sequences, inherited fragments from ancient viruses, and long stretches whose roles may be subtle, limited, or still unclear. These sequences are packaged into chromosomes, the large structures visible under a microscope when cells divide. Humans usually have 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs. That number is important, but it is not the same thing as a complete explanation of what makes us human. This is where many ancient engineering claims begin to blur several different biological ideas together. They speak of genes, chromosomes, DNA, species, hybrids, and mutations as though they are interchangeable pieces on the same game board. They are connected, but they are not the same. Changing a single gene is one kind of intervention. Moving a gene from one organism into another is another. Altering an embryo is different from altering an adult. Changing the chromosome number of a lineage is different again. And producing a stable, fertile population from such changes is not a small final step. It is the hardest part of the entire story. Modern genetic engineering, in its real form, rests on a long chain of knowledge and equipment. Scientists must understand the sequence they are targeting. They must have a way to cut DNA at a particular site or introduce new material with some degree of control. They must deliver that change into cells. If the goal is to produce a heritable change, they must affect reproductive cells or embryos. Then the altered organisms must survive development, reproduce, and pass the change onward without catastrophic side effects. Even today, with microscopes, sequencing machines, sterile laboratories, enzymes, cell cultures, computational tools, and decades of molecular biology behind us, this is delicate work. It does not look like the casual mixing of clay and divine blood. The older phrase gene-splicing often refers to recombinant DNA techniques, cutting DNA and joining pieces together, sometimes using enzymes derived from bacteria. Later technologies gave scientists more precise tools. CRISPR, for example, uses a guide system to target specific DNA sequences, though even that word has been inflated in public imagination. CRISPR is powerful, but it is not a magic wand. It can miss targets. Cells repair cuts in unpredictable ways. A change that works in a dish may fail in a living organism. A change that seems beneficial in one setting may create problems elsewhere. Biology has a habit of charging interest on every shortcut. So if we imagine, for the sake of argument, an ancient genetic project designed to alter a hominin population into modern humans, the scale becomes enormous. It would not be enough to modify one individual. It would not be enough to produce one unusual child. To shape the ancestry of all living humans, the change would have to enter a breeding population and persist across generations. It would have to fit into reproduction, development, immunity, brain growth, metabolism, and countless other systems. If the story includes changing the number of chromosomes, the challenge becomes even greater, because chromosome structure affects how cells divide and how embryos develop. This does not make artificial intervention logically impossible in the abstract. Science should be careful with the word impossible. But it does mean the claim belongs in the category of extraordinary claims. And extraordinary claims need something more durable than a suggestive mythic phrase. What would evidence look like? We would expect, at minimum, biological signals that resist ordinary evolutionary explanation. Perhaps a segment of DNA appearing suddenly in the human lineage with no plausible ancestry in related species. Perhaps sequences arranged in a way strongly resembling known engineering methods, though one must be cautious here. because nature itself can produce strange insertions, duplications, inversions, and viral integrations. We might expect abrupt, coordinated changes across many genes that serve a design-like purpose and appear too tightly organized to fit known mechanisms. We might expect archaeological evidence of an advanced biological technology, tools, residues, facilities, repeated symbolic or technical records, or some material trace that connects a culture to actual manipulation of living tissue. Most importantly, we would need the evidence to point in the same direction from different fields. Genetics alone would not be enough if the signal could be explained by natural processes. Myth alone would not be enough if the language belongs comfortably within ancient religious imagination. A few unusual words on a damaged tablet would not carry the weight of rewriting human origins. The case would have to become stronger as we tested it, not weaker. And this is where the ancient laboratory narrative begins to struggle. It often starts with a real mystery or a real scientific detail, then builds a bridge made of suggestion. Humans have 23 chromosome pairs. Other great apes have 24. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe gods creating humans. Enki is associated with wisdom, craft, and the deep waters. Therefore, the argument goes, these texts may preserve a memory of genetic engineering. The problem is that the therefore is doing almost all the work. In the actual practice of science, similarity is not proof of connection. Two ideas can resemble each other because one caused the other, but also because humans are very good at pattern making. Ancient creation stories use the materials their cultures understood: clay, breath, blood, water, speech, divine skill. Modern genetic stories use the materials we understand: DNA, chromosomes, cells, inheritance. When we translate the ancient image into modern language too quickly, we may not be discovering hidden science. We may simply be replacing one symbolic vocabulary with another. There is also a subtle misunderstanding in the way engineering is imagined. Engineering suggests intention. It implies that someone knew the outcome in advance. Evolution, by contrast, has no blueprint. It works through variation, inheritance, selection, drift, isolation, and time. That can feel unsatisfying because it lacks a central designer. But it also explains why living things are so full of compromises. The human body is not a perfect machine. Our backs ache. Our teeth crowd. Childbirth is dangerous compared with many mammals. Our immune systems can misfire. Our minds are brilliant, but not always kind to themselves. If we were designed from scratch by flawless technicians, the evidence is at least mixed. If we emerged through a long, improvised evolutionary process, the awkwardness makes more sense. This does not diminish the wonder. If anything, it makes it stranger. The human genome carries the marks of deep kinship, shared sequences with other primates, traces of ancient duplications, broken genes, viral fossils, and inherited structures that make sense only when placed inside a branching tree of life. Modern genetics did not flatten the mystery of humanity. It gave the mystery a history. The ancient engineering theory often gains strength from the feeling that gaps in knowledge are openings for hidden answers. And there are gaps. Scientists do not understand every function of every sequence. They continue to debate the roles of non-coding DNA, the timing of certain evolutionary changes, and the relationship between genes and complex traits like language or cognition. But a gap is not the same as a fingerprint. Not knowing everything is not evidence that someone intervened. It is an invitation to investigate more carefully. There is a more generous way to understand why the gene-splicing story became attractive. It translates myth into the most powerful language of our age. For the Sumerians and Akkadians, creation could be imagined through clay, divine essence, and ritual craftsmanship. For us, creation is imagined through genomes, laboratories, and molecular tools. We have taken the old question, what are we, and who made us this way, and dressed it in the clothing of biotechnology. But real biotechnology leaves traces. It requires mechanisms. It makes predictions that can be tested. If a civilization, terrestrial or otherwise, altered the human lineage in a way that shaped all of us, the claim cannot remain forever in the soft borderland between metaphor and mistranslation. At some point, it has to meet the genome directly. And when we meet the genome directly, we find something remarkable, but not quite the thing promised by the viral legend. We find a record of descent, not a signed confession. We find scars and repairs, duplications and losses, ancient accidents that became inheritances. We find a body written by time. One of those marks is especially important: the fusion that helped produce human chromosome 2. It is real. It is measurable. It is one of the strongest pieces of evidence connecting us to the wider primate family. But to understand why it matters, we have to look closely at the scar itself. There is a place in the human genome that looks, at first glance, like a seam, not a glowing mark, not a divine signature, not a line of code left behind by visitors from the sky. Just a stretch of DNA buried inside one of our chromosomes, where the usual pattern seems to hesitate. And if you know what to look for, that hesitation matters. Chromosome 2 is one of the largest chromosomes in the human body. It carries thousands of genes and vast regions of DNA whose functions range from well-studied to still uncertain. But its real fame comes from something stranger. When scientists compare the human genome with the genomes of other great apes, chromosome 2 appears to be the result of two older chromosomes joined end to end. This is the heart of the real mystery. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans have 48. If humans and the other great apes share common ancestry, then somewhere in the human line, something had to happen. Either our ancestors lost a pair of chromosomes, or two chromosomes became one. For a long time before DNA sequencing gave us sharper tools, this was not an absurd problem. It was a serious question. A difference in chromosome number is not small. Chromosomes are not decorative beads on a string. They are large structures involved in inheritance, development, and reproduction. And yet, evolution does not require chromosome numbers to remain fixed forever. Chromosomes can break, rearrange, duplicate, invert, and fuse. These events are not everyday miracles. They are part of the rough machinery of biological history. Sometimes they are harmful. Sometimes they disappear because the individuals carrying them leave no descendants. Sometimes, if circumstances allow, they persist. The evidence for chromosome 2 fusion does not rest on one clue. That is important. It is not a single ambiguous mark being asked to carry an entire theory. It is a convergence of several independent lines of evidence, each pointing toward the same conclusion. The first clue comes from comparison. When researchers line up human chromosome 2 against the chromosomes of chimpanzees and other great apes, they find a remarkable correspondence. Human chromosome 2 matches, in broad structure and gene order, two separate ape chromosomes. In chimpanzees, these are often described as chromosomes corresponding to the two ancestral segments that became human chromosome 2. The genes are not randomly similar. They appear in long matching stretches, in the same general order, like two volumes of an older manuscript that have been bound together into one larger book. That alone is suggestive. But the second clue is more intimate. At the ends of chromosomes are telomeres. These are repetitive DNA sequences that help protect chromosome ends. In humans and many other vertebrates, the repeating pattern is commonly represented as TTAGGG, repeated again and again. Telomeres are like protective caps, though that metaphor can make them sound more solid and intentional than they are. They are dynamic biological structures, not plastic tips on shoelaces. If two chromosomes fused end to end, one might expect to find traces of telomere-like sequence at the fusion point, not at the end of the chromosome, but somewhere inside it. And that is exactly what researchers found on human chromosome 2. A region of degenerated, head-to-head telomeric repeats located internally, in a position consistent with a fusion between two ancestral chromosomes. The word degenerated matters. The sequence is not a pristine row of perfect repeats, as if the fusion happened yesterday and was sealed in glass. It has been altered over evolutionary time. Mutations have accumulated. The pattern is messy. Critics of the fusion model sometimes point to that messiness as though it weakens the evidence. But in biology, ancient traces are often worn. A clean, untouched fusion site after millions of years would be more surprising than a damaged one. There is a quiet lesson here about how evidence ages. We often imagine proof as something crisp and complete. But deep time rarely leaves crisp edges. It leaves partial signatures, overlapping patterns, scars that have healed into the surrounding tissue. The question is not whether the mark looks like a diagram in a textbook. The question is whether the mark makes sense in relation to everything else around it. And chromosome 2 gives us still another clue, the centromere. A centromere is the region of a chromosome involved in proper separation during cell division. Each normal chromosome typically has one active centromere. If human chromosome 2 formed from the fusion of two ancestral chromosomes, then the new chromosome would have inherited two centromere regions. But a chromosome with two active centromeres can be unstable. Over time, one centromere would need to be inactivated or lost in function. Human chromosome 2 has one active centromere. But elsewhere on the chromosome, researchers have identified remnants consistent with an ancestral, inactive centromere. Again, not a theatrical announcement. Not an engraved label saying, "Fusion occurred here," but a region that fits the expected pattern. One functioning centromere, and one ghost of a centromere where the second ancestral chromosome once carried its own. This is why chromosome 2 is so powerful as evidence. It does not merely say, humans are different. It explains one of the differences in a way that is testable, comparative, and physical. The human chromosome count is not an embarrassment for evolution. It is one of the places where evolution leaves fingerprints. But because this evidence is so striking, it has also become a magnet for stranger interpretations. In modern ancient engineering theories, chromosome 2 is sometimes described as the smoking gun of artificial intervention. The argument usually goes like this. Humans have one fewer pair of chromosomes than other great apes. Chromosome 2 appears fused. Therefore, someone must have fused it deliberately. In the more elaborate versions, that someone becomes a god, an extraterrestrial scientist, or an advanced being remembered in Mesopotamian myth. It is an appealing move because it takes a real scientific discovery and gives it a narrative face. A fusion event becomes an operation. A genomic scar becomes a signature. Evolution becomes a crime scene. But the interpretation is doing more work than the evidence allows. A chromosome fusion, by itself, is not evidence of engineering. Natural chromosome fusions are known in living organisms. They can occur through errors in DNA repair, reproductive cell formation, or chromosomal breakage and reunion. In some lineages, chromosome numbers vary significantly, even among closely related species. The fact that a fusion happened does not tell us that a technician made it happen. To argue for artificial design, one would need more than the fusion. One would need signs of deliberate construction, inserted sequences that clearly do not belong, technological markers, patterns inconsistent with known biological mechanisms, or archaeological evidence tying such a manipulation to a specific external agent. We do not have that. What we have is a fusion site that looks biologically plausible, comparative genomic data that fits common ancestry, and centromere evidence that matches the expected aftermath of a natural fusion. This does not make the event uninteresting. Quite the opposite. It makes it more interesting because it shows how a major structural change in the genome could become part of the inheritance of an entire lineage. There is still room for careful uncertainty. Scientists do not know every detail of the original event. We cannot point to the individual in whom the fusion first appeared. We cannot reconstruct the social life, health, or reproductive success of that ancient carrier. The fusion must have passed through a population, eventually becoming fixed in the ancestors of all living humans. It also appears to have been inherited by archaic human relatives such as Neanderthals and Denisovans, meaning it predates the split between those groups and modern humans. But the exact pathway by which it spread remains a matter of population history, not mythic certainty. And this is where the story becomes subtler than the sensational versions allow. The fusion of chromosome 2 did not instantly create modern humanity. It did not turn an ape into a person in a single flash. It was one event in a long evolutionary landscape involving brain development, tool use, social behavior, climate pressure, migration, extinction, and interbreeding. If chromosome 2 is a scar, it is not the whole body. It is one healed line among countless others. Some people misunderstand this point in both directions. Skeptics of evolution may treat the fusion as too improbable to be natural. Enthusiasts of ancient intervention may treat it as too meaningful to be accidental. But biology is full of events that are both natural and consequential. A mutation can be random in origin and still become historically important. A chromosomal accident can become an ancestral inheritance. Meaning is not always proof of intention. That is perhaps the most difficult idea to accept. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We look at the genome and want it to behave like a message. We want seams to be signatures, gaps to be secrets, complexity to be evidence of a hidden hand. And sometimes, in science, patterns really do reveal astonishing truths. But the discipline lies in asking what kind of truth the pattern supports. Chromosome 2 supports the reality of shared ancestry with other great apes. It supports the idea that our lineage passed through a major chromosomal rearrangement. It supports the patient, unglamorous power of comparative genomics. What it does not support, at least with the evidence we currently have, is the claim that an ancient Mesopotamian god or a remembered extraterrestrial engineer deliberately redesigned our species. The irony is that the real discovery is already extraordinary. Inside every cell of your body, there is a chromosome carrying the trace of an event that happened before recorded history, before cities, before writing, before anyone imagined gods shaping humans from clay. It is not a forbidden tablet. It is not a lost laboratory note. It is quieter than that. A seam, carried forward by generations. A scar that became inheritance. And in its own restrained way, it tells us something more profound than the myth of a sudden design. That human origins were not written in one dramatic act, but accumulated through countless fragile changes, most of them invisible, until one branch of life learned to look back at its own chromosomes and wonder what they meant. There is a phrase that has done more damage in public imagination than almost any phrase in modern genetics. Junk DNA. It sounds dismissive, almost careless, as if scientists opened the human genome, found long stretches they did not understand, shrugged, and tossed them into a mental wastebasket. And once that phrase entered popular culture, it became a door. Through it came all kinds of claims. That hidden code had been planted in us, that dormant alien instructions were waiting to awaken, that modern science had ignored the most important parts of the genome because it was too arrogant to look closely. The trouble is, the real story is more interesting than the myth. The term junk DNA did not originally mean that scientists were stupid, lazy, or blind. It emerged from a difficult discovery. Much of the DNA in complex organisms does not code directly for proteins. In the older, simpler public version of genetics, a gene was imagined like a recipe, and DNA was the cookbook. One stretch of DNA produced one useful thing, another stretch produced another. So when researchers found enormous regions that did not seem to behave this way, the natural question was unsettling. What was all of it doing there? In humans, only a small percentage of the genome consists of protein-coding genes. The exact figure depends on how one defines and counts, but it is often placed around 1 to 2%. To anyone hearing that for the first time, it can sound absurd. If only a tiny portion codes for proteins, then what is the rest? Dead material? Evolutionary clutter? A message waiting to be decrypted? This is where the misunderstanding begins. DNA is not a tidy library arranged for human convenience. It is more like an old city built over itself for millions of years. Foundations under foundations, abandoned streets, reused stones, broken walls absorbed into new buildings, and occasional structures still performing important work, even though no one would have designed them that way from scratch. Evolution does not usually clean the desk. It modifies what is already there. It copies, deletes, breaks, preserves, and repurposes. Sometimes a sequence persists because it is useful. Sometimes because it is harmless enough. Sometimes because it is difficult to remove without disturbing something nearby. Some non-coding DNA has clear and essential functions. It can help regulate when genes turn on or off. It can influence how DNA is packaged inside the nucleus. It can contribute to chromosome structure. It can play roles in development, timing, cell identity, and the complicated choreography that allows the same genome to produce a neuron, a liver cell, a skin cell, or an immune cell. If protein-coding genes are the visible machinery, regulatory DNA helps decide when the machinery runs, where it runs, and how loudly. That is not a small thing. A creature is not built merely by owning the right parts. It is built by using them in the right sequence, in the right tissue, at the right stage of life. This is one reason why genetic differences between species cannot be understood simply by counting genes like coins on a table. Humans and other animals share many genes, but development depends heavily on regulation. The difference between two organisms may lie not only in what genes they possess, but in how those genes are coordinated. And yet, it would be just as misleading to swing to the opposite extreme and declare that all so-called junk DNA is secretly functional in some grand, hidden way. That is another kind of myth, only wearing a more flattering mask. Some DNA sequences appear to be remnants of ancient viral insertions. Some are repetitive elements that have copied themselves throughout the genome. Some may have little or no meaningful effect on the organism's survival. Some may be slightly harmful, slightly useful, or neutral, depending on context. The genome is not a sacred manuscript in which every letter must contain a profound message. It is a biological record shaped by deep time, accident, selection, drift, constraint, and occasional innovation. This nuance matters because extraordinary theories often live in the gap between not fully understood and therefore anything is possible. When people claim that junk DNA is proof of ancient engineering, they usually depend on a particular emotional move. They point to what science has not yet completely explained, and then they fill that space with intention. Unknown becomes hidden. Complex becomes designed. Non-coding becomes encrypted. But in science, a gap in knowledge is not automatically evidence for the most dramatic explanation available. It is simply a place where more work is needed. There is a quiet discipline in saying, "We do not know yet." It may not travel as quickly online as forbidden alien code discovered in human DNA, but it is far more honest. The history of genetics is full of cases where researchers revised their understanding. That is not a weakness. It is the method doing its job. Early assumptions about DNA changed as new tools became available. Sequencing improved. Comparative genomics advanced. Researchers began comparing genomes across species, looking not only at genes but at patterns of conservation and change. If a non-coding region remains highly conserved across vast evolutionary distances, that may suggest it has an important function. If a sequence varies wildly or appears repeatedly in broken copies, it may suggest a different story. There are also large projects that tried to map biochemical activity across the genome. These efforts showed that many regions once dismissed too casually are transcribed or bound by proteins or involved in cellular processes. But even here, interpretation requires care. Biochemical activity is not the same as proven biological necessity. A city at night may have lights in many windows. That does not mean every room is central to the government. Some signals matter greatly. Some may be incidental. Sorting one from the other is slow work, and slow work is exactly what myth-making tends to dislike. The ancient engineering version of the junk DNA argument often presents the genome as if it contains obvious foreign modules placed there by beings with advanced technology. But if such an intervention happened in the way these claims usually imply, we would expect evidence that could be examined. Unusual genetic patterns inconsistent with known evolutionary relationships, clear discontinuities in ancestry, inserted sequences with no plausible natural source, or artifacts in the genome that point to tools, not just processes. The evidence offered rarely meets that standard. More often, it consists of awe, ambiguity, and a strong desire for the human story to have a secret author. That desire is understandable. There is something eerie about carrying within us a record we did not write, one that reaches back through primates, mammals, reptiles, fish, and earlier life. The genome feels intimate because it is inside us, yet alien because no individual mind designed it. It contains traces of old infections, ancient duplications, failed experiments, and preserved solutions. It is both inheritance and archive. One can see why people look at it and imagine a hidden hand. But the hidden hand is not required to make the story profound. In fact, the real genome may be stranger than the engineered one. A designed genome suggests a plan. Evolutionary history suggests a struggle. Countless organisms living, reproducing, failing, adapting. Small changes accumulating through spans of time too large to comfortably imagine. The human genome is not a clean blueprint lowered from the sky. It is a weathered document copied and recopied by life itself, full of edits, scars, margins, and passages whose meaning depends on where and when they are read. This is where the phrase junk DNA becomes both useful and dangerous. Useful, because it once captured a real scientific puzzle. Why do genomes contain so much material that does not code for proteins? Dangerous, because outside its technical context, it encouraged the impression that scientists had declared most of our DNA worthless. They had not. Many researchers argued over the term from the beginning, and many avoided it precisely because it could mislead. Today, the more careful language is non-coding DNA, repetitive DNA, regulatory elements, transposable elements, and other specific categories. The genome is not one unexplained darkness. It is a landscape with many kinds of terrain. Some of that terrain is now better mapped. Some remains difficult. And some may never satisfy our hunger for a simple answer. The ancient astronaut interpretation often turns that difficulty into a kind of invitation. If scientists are still debating function, then perhaps the missing function is cosmic. If some DNA is dormant, perhaps it is waiting for activation. If humans are unusual, perhaps we were altered. These claims work because they borrow the language of science without accepting the discipline of evidence. They use real words: gene, chromosome, code, mutation, sequence, but place them inside a story that has not earned them. There is a difference between mystery and permission. A mystery asks us to investigate. Permission says we may believe whatever feels most dramatic. The genome deserves the first, not the second. What we can say with confidence is that non-coding DNA is not a single thing with a single meaning. Some of it matters deeply. Some of it may be evolutionary residue. Some of it may have subtle effects we are only beginning to understand. Some may matter only under certain conditions, in certain tissues, or at certain moments of development. And yes, there is still much we do not know. But uncertainty is not a blank tablet on which any theory can be carved. The old myth of junk DNA survives because it flatters two instincts at once: the suspicion that official knowledge is incomplete, and the hope that we are more special than biology has admitted. It offers a secret chamber inside the self. But when we look carefully, the genome does not need to be a coded alien archive to be astonishing. It is already a record of survival across deep time, written in a language older than any temple, older than Sumer, older than myth. And perhaps that is the more difficult wonder to accept. Not that someone engineered us in a hidden laboratory, but that life, without foresight, without ceremony, and without asking our permission, carried us here. If we want to understand why the ancient Mesopotamian creation stories have been so easy to transform into modern theories of genetic engineering, we have to pause over one uncomfortable detail. In many of these myths, humanity is not created as a crown jewel. Not at first. Not in the sentimental way later traditions sometimes imagine. Humanity is made because work has become a problem. That is the strange, blunt power of the old stories. The gods are tired. The canals must be maintained. The fields must be watered. Food must be produced. Offerings must be made. The divine world in these texts is not always a realm of effortless perfection. It is imagined through the logic of the society that produced the story. Organized labor, hierarchy, obligation, and the constant demand to keep life moving in a difficult landscape. Mesopotamia was a civilization built between rivers, but that phrase can make it sound gentler than it was. The Tigris and Euphrates did not simply hand out abundance like generous parents. Their waters could nourish, but they could also shift, flood, recede, and leave communities dependent on human planning. Agriculture required coordination. Irrigation was not a decorative achievement. It was survival made into infrastructure. Canals had to be dug and cleared. Fields had to be managed. Grain had to be stored, measured, redistributed, and guarded. The city was not just a place where people lived. It was a machine of labor, belief, and administration. So when a Mesopotamian myth says humans were created to relieve the gods of toil, it is doing more than inventing a fantasy about origins. It is translating the deepest structure of that world into sacred language. Work was not incidental to human life. Work was the condition of human life. And the temple, at the center of many cities, gave that labor a cosmic direction. This is the part that often disappears in modern reinterpretations. The ancient phrase becomes a clue in a conspiracy. Humans were made to serve the gods. Therefore, perhaps the gods were alien overseers. Humans were fashioned for labor. Therefore, perhaps they were engineered as a workforce. But that leap tells us more about modern suspicion than ancient religion. It replaces a social and theological idea with a technological one, as if the only serious explanation for creation must involve a laboratory, a procedure, and a hidden project. The older meaning is not less powerful. In some ways, it is more disturbing. To serve the gods in Mesopotamia did not simply mean private belief. It meant feeding them, clothing them, housing them, honoring them, maintaining their temples, and sustaining the order that tied heaven to earth. The statue of a god in a temple was not treated as a symbolic ornament in the modern sense. It could be approached as a living presence, ritually cared for, presented with food, dressed, praised, and protected. Human communities organized enormous portions of their economy around divine households. The temple had land, workers, goods, scribes, livestock, and storerooms. It was both sacred center and economic institution. In that world, the idea that humans exist to perform labor for the gods was not necessarily a humiliating footnote. It was a worldview. The gods sustained the cosmos. Humans sustained the gods' earthly houses. The relationship was unequal, but it was not meaningless. To work, to offer, to farm, to build, to serve, these were not merely economic acts. They were woven into the maintenance of order itself. And yet, there is a tension here that we should not smooth away too quickly. These myths also sound like the voice of people who knew the burden of being useful. In the Atrahasis tradition, The lesser gods labor until they rebel, and humanity is created to take over the work. The story has a dry, almost bureaucratic honesty to it. Someone has to dig, someone has to carry, someone has to maintain the system. The myth does not hide labor beneath noble abstractions. It places toil at the center of creation. Human beings appear because the divine workforce has reached its limit. That does not require genetic engineering to be meaningful. It may instead be one of the earliest great reflections on exploitation, hierarchy, and the origin of social obligation. The myth asks, in its own ancient language, why are we born into work? Why must life be sustained through exhaustion? Why does the world demand service from us before it offers comfort? For people living in city-states where grain, taxes, temple duties, and royal projects shaped daily existence, that question was not philosophical decoration. It was practical. It was felt in the body. This is where kingship enters the story. Mesopotamian kings often presented themselves as chosen by the gods, servants of the gods, builders of temples, restorers of order, and protectors of the land. Their authority was not merely political. It was framed as cosmic responsibility. A king who built or repaired a temple was not just improving architecture. He was demonstrating that divine favor flowed through him. He kept the bond between the human city and the divine realm intact. But that sacred order also justified human labor. Workers built walls, canals, temples, and palaces. Farmers delivered produce. Craftsmen made offerings and luxury goods. Scribes recorded everything with extraordinary care. The machinery of civilization required many hands, and myth helped explain why those hands had a place within a larger design. Modern readers sometimes underestimate how persuasive that design could be. We tend to separate economy, religion, and politics into different rooms. Ancient Mesopotamia did not always make those separations so neatly. A canal was practical, but it could also be part of divine order. A temple ration was economic, but it could also belong to sacred administration. A king's building inscription was propaganda, yes, but also theology, memory, and public performance. So when the myths describe humanity as a labor force for the gods, we are hearing the religious imagination of a labor-organized society. The gods are divine masters, but they are also magnified reflections of the earthly systems people knew: households, estates, ranks, obligations, and service. Heaven resembles a great institution because earth was full of institutions. This is not a flaw in the myth. It is how myth often works. It takes the structure of a society and enlarges it until it touches the sky. The ancient astronaut interpretation depends on treating this resemblance as evidence of something literal and external. Gods demanding labor begin to look like colonizers. Divine craft begins to look like biotechnology. Creation from clay begins to look like manipulation of organic material. A mythic workforce becomes a genetically modified species. The pattern is seductive because it offers a clean, hidden mechanism behind human suffering. Someone made us this way. Someone designed us to serve. But the texts themselves do not need that mechanism. Their emotional force comes from a more recognizable truth. Human beings have always lived inside systems they did not choose. We are born into hunger, weather, debt, duty, family, hierarchy, expectation, and death. Ancient Mesopotamians gave those conditions a mythic origin. They imagined a time before human labor, when the gods themselves bore the burden. Then they imagined the burden being transferred. That is a profound idea. It says work is not an accident. It is built into the human condition. It may be sacred, necessary, unfair, dignified, exhausting, and inescapable all at once. There is also a quieter irony here. In these stories, humans are created to serve the gods, but once humans exist, the gods depend on them. Offerings, temples, praise, ritual care, all of these require human participation. The hierarchy remains, but the relationship is not one-directional. The gods may be superior, but their earthly presence is maintained through human devotion and labor. The servants become necessary. That detail matters because it complicates the simple image of humans as disposable slaves. Mesopotamian religion certainly contains fear, hierarchy, and submission, but it also contains negotiation. Humans pray, lament, bargain, complain, praise, and seek favor. Kings boast of service, but also request protection. Rituals feed the gods, but also secure blessings for the city. The relationship is unequal, yet interactive. In that sense, the creation for labor motif may reveal less about biology than about dependency. The gods need a world that functions. The city needs divine protection. The king needs legitimacy. The temple needs offerings. The field needs water. The worker needs grain. Everyone is bound into a chain of service, from the heavens down to the irrigation ditch. This is why reducing the myth to a story of alien mining or laboratory design can actually make it smaller. It turns a dense ancient meditation on labor, divinity, and civilization into a single hidden plot. It takes a society's way of explaining obligation and translates it into modern machinery. The result may feel more thrilling, but it loses the weight of the original question. And the original question has not aged out of relevance. Even now, thousands of years later, people still ask whether human beings were made for something beyond themselves, for service, for survival, for production, for worship, for knowledge, for love, or for burdens no one asked to carry. The Mesopotamian answer was shaped by fields, temples, kings, and gods. Our answers are shaped by offices, factories, algorithms, nations, and economies. The costumes have changed. The unease remains. That may be why these myths continue to attract reinterpretation. A story that says humans were created to work touches a nerve. It feels too close. And when a story feels too close, we often push it farther away. We send it into space. We hide it in a forbidden tablet. We imagine that if the origin is strange enough, perhaps the burden will feel less ordinary. But the ancient scribes left us something more unsettling than a science fiction code. They left us a vision of humanity standing between need and worship, between mud and heaven, between exhaustion and meaning. In their world, to be human was to carry the work that even the gods no longer wished to bear. And whether we read that as theology, social memory, or mythic poetry, it does not require a gene-splicing chamber beneath the Abzu to matter. It only requires us to recognize the oldest ache in civilization. Someone must keep the world running. Ancient texts do not arrive in our hands as clear voices. They arrive broken, copied, buried, recopied, translated, catalogued, debated, and sometimes misunderstood long before the public ever sees a single line of them. A clay tablet may look solid, almost stubbornly factual, But the words pressed into it are not always as stable as the clay itself. A missing corner can remove a verb. A damaged sign can turn certainty into probability. A word that seems simple in English may have carried religious, legal, poetic, and ritual meanings all at once. This is where many modern mysteries are born. Not always from fraud, and not always from ignorance, but from the narrow space between an ancient phrase and a modern imagination eager to complete it. Sumerian and Akkadian were not written like English. Their scripts were part of a long scribal tradition in which signs could represent sounds, words, divine names, categories, or ideas. A single cuneiform sign might have more than one possible reading, depending on context. Scribes knew this system because they were trained inside it. We approach it from the outside, thousands of years later, often through fragments and scholarly reconstructions. By the time a line from an ancient tablet appears in a viral post or a late-night documentary clip, it may have passed through several layers: excavation, copying, transliteration, translation, interpretation, simplification, and finally, performance. At each layer, something can shift. This does not mean scholars are guessing wildly. Assyriology is not a game of mystical decoding. It is a disciplined field built on comparative texts, lexical lists, bilingual inscriptions, grammar, archaeology, and generations of careful work. But translation is still not mechanical. It requires judgment. When a scholar translates a mythological phrase about a god fashioning humanity, they are making a responsible choice based on language and context. When a modern theorist then takes the word fashioning and reads it as genetically engineering, a different kind of choice has been made. One that usually tells us more about the modern reader than about the ancient scribe. That distinction matters. In Mesopotamian creation stories, the language of making is often material, ritual, and symbolic. Humans are formed from clay. Divine elements are mixed in. Gods speak, plan, shape, assign duties, and establish order. These are not casual images. Clay was the substance of tablets, bricks, figurines, riverbanks, and human labor. It was everywhere in Mesopotamian life. To say that humanity came from clay was not a primitive attempt at chemistry. It was a way of describing dependence, fragility, usefulness, and origin in a world built from mud and water. It placed the human body inside the landscape itself. But if one begins with the assumption that the gods were scientists, the same passage begins to look different. Clay becomes organic substrate. Divine blood becomes genetic material. The act of mixing becomes laboratory procedure. A mythic workshop becomes a research facility. The movement is subtle at first, almost elegant. Then it accelerates. Before long, a story about divine labor and human service has been refitted as a technical report from prehistory. The problem is not imagination. Imagination is necessary when we read ancient literature. Without it, the texts remain dead marks on clay. The problem is when imagination disguises itself as translation. One common tactic in speculative readings is to isolate a single word or phrase from its literary environment. A line that belongs to a hymn, ritual, or myth is lifted out and treated as if it were a literal engineering note. The ancient world, however, did not divide reality into the same compartments we do. Religion, politics, agriculture, medicine, kingship, and cosmology were tightly interwoven. A god of wisdom could also be linked to water, magic, craft, and creation without being a geneticist in disguise. A divine assembly could make decisions about humanity without functioning like a board of extraterrestrial administrators. Ancient language often works by association, not by technical definition. This is especially important with words that modern audiences already find mysterious. Anunnaki, Abzu, Mi, Apkallu, Dingir. These terms carry weight because they sound unfamiliar, and unfamiliar words are easy to make larger than they are. Anunnaki, for example, is often presented in popular culture as though its meaning were straightforward proof of beings descending from the sky. But the term, in scholarly usage, refers to groups of Mesopotamian deities, and its exact etymological history is not a simple key that unlocks alien visitation. Later traditions use divine categories in different ways. Names shift, roles change, myths evolve. Treating one dramatic modern rendering as the final truth flattens a very complicated religious landscape. The same thing happens with the Abzu. In the ancient sources, it is connected with the deep freshwater realm, with Enki or Ea, with wisdom, fertility, and hidden power. That alone is fascinating. It does not need to become a submerged genetics lab to deserve attention. Yet the modern mind, trained by science fiction and secret project narratives, sees hidden watery domain of a creator god and begins furnishing it with instruments, vats, and controlled experiments. The image is compelling. It is also an overlay. The ancient text gives us a mythic deep, not a floor plan. There is a useful caution here. The more a translation sounds like modern technology, the more carefully we should inspect it. Ancient Mesopotamian texts do contain technical language. They include administrative records, mathematical exercises, omen collections, medical recipes, astronomical observations, and legal documents. These writings can be astonishingly precise. Scribes could count, classify, record transactions, observe patterns, and preserve specialist knowledge with discipline. So if a tablet were genuinely describing something like chromosomes, DNA, gene-splicing, or species modification, we would expect some kind of linguistic footprint. Repeated technical terms, procedural sequences, comparable contexts, scribal commentary, or at least a pattern that cannot be explained by mythological convention. Instead, the genetic engineering interpretation tends to depend on metaphor being treated as machinery. A god opens something, so it becomes surgical intervention. A goddess forms a human, so it becomes cloning. Divine essence becomes DNA. A created worker becomes a modified hominin. None of these leaps is impossible as fiction. As historical interpretation, they require evidence that the words themselves do not provide. The gap is filled by assumption, and this is where selective quotation becomes powerful. A full myth may contain ritual repetition, theological concern, social commentary, humor, contradiction, and poetic structure. A clipped quotation, however, can be made to point in only one direction. Remove the surrounding lines about divine councils, offerings, temple order, and the burdens of agricultural labor, and the remaining phrase begins to float free. Once detached, it can be attached to almost anything. This is not unique to Mesopotamia. Ancient Egyptian texts, biblical passages, Vedic hymns, Maya inscriptions, and Greek myths have all been pulled into modern technological readings. Flying chariots become spacecraft. Divine weapons become lasers. Flood stories become encoded memories of planetary catastrophe. Sometimes these comparisons are playful. Sometimes they are sincere attempts to find ancient memory beneath myth. But sincerity does not solve the central problem. Similarity is not proof of identity. A shining divine weapon may resemble modern technology because human beings across cultures use brightness, thunder, fire, and height to describe power. That does not mean the ancient author saw a missile launch. The danger is not that we ask bold questions. The danger is that we forget ancient people had their own symbolic intelligence. To read every strange phrase as misunderstood science is, in a quiet way, a form of disrespect. It assumes that myth is valuable only if it secretly contains modern knowledge. But Mesopotamian myths do not need hidden chromosomes to be profound. They are already wrestling with why humans work, why gods require worship, why cities depend on hierarchy, why wisdom is dangerous, why creation is mixed with obligation. These are not lesser questions. They are the architecture of civilization. There is also a psychological comfort in technological translation. If ancient texts contain secret science, then history becomes a puzzle with a missing manual. Someone knew. Someone recorded it. Someone hid it or mistranslated it. The past becomes a locked archive waiting for the right outsider to see through the academic fog. That story is emotionally satisfying because it gives mystery a villain and revelation a hero. But real scholarship is usually less theatrical. It advances by grammar, fragments, parallels, and restraint. It often says, "This line is uncertain," where the internet would rather say, "This line proves everything." Restraint can feel disappointing. It is also where honesty lives. The spaces between ancient words are not empty. They contain damaged clay, lost context, scribal tradition, religious imagination, and modern desire. They invite interpretation, but they do not surrender to any interpretation we prefer. When a translation is careful, it opens a window. When it is forced, it becomes a mirror, reflecting our own obsessions back at us in antique clothing. So when someone claims that a Sumerian tablet describes laboratories, DNA, cloning, or chromosome design, the first question should not be, could ancient people have known more than we think? That is a fair question, but it comes later. The first question is quieter and more demanding. What do the words actually say? Not what can they be made to suggest after passing through modern fear, wonder, and science fiction. Not what a dramatic paraphrase implies. Not what a single isolated term appears to resemble. What do the texts say in their own world, among their own gods, rivers, temples, burdens, and hopes? The answer is still strange. It is still powerful. But it is not the same story. The strange durability of the Anunnaki genetic engineering theory does not come from evidence alone. If it did, it would have faded long ago, quietly filed away beside other grand ideas that could not survive contact with tablets, bones, and genomes. Its survival comes from something deeper and more human. It offers not just an explanation, but a feeling. It tells us that our confusion has a source, that the ache of being human, intelligent, restless, violent, tender, unfinished, is not an accident of evolution or culture, but the trace of an ancient intervention. It suggests that somewhere, Behind myth and priesthood and broken clay, there is a hidden answer to why we are the way we are. That is powerful and powerfully tempting, because the theory does not arrive as a simple claim. It arrives as a story with all the right ingredients. Gods who descend from the sky, forbidden knowledge, missing pieces in the human past, misunderstood ancient texts, and a biological difference that seems, at first glance, almost too neat to be ordinary. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Other great apes have 24. Mesopotamian myths speak of gods creating humans to labor. Enki is associated with wisdom, craft, and the mysterious deep. The Anunnaki are divine beings. Put these pieces beside one another, and the modern imagination begins to hear a pattern. But patterns are not always proof. Sometimes they are the mind doing what the mind has always done, connecting distant lights into constellations. Still, it would be too easy to dismiss the people drawn to this theory as merely gullible. That would miss the more interesting question. Why does this particular idea feel so convincing to so many people? Why does it keep returning, decade after decade, repackaged through books, documentaries, podcasts, comment threads, and short videos with ominous music and a thumbnail of a winged figure beside a DNA helix? Part of the answer is distrust. Modern institutions have not always earned public confidence. Governments have hidden things. Corporations have manipulated evidence. Academic establishments have, at times, resisted inconvenient ideas before later accepting them. Archaeology itself has a history marked by colonial theft, academic rivalry, and interpretations shaped by the assumptions of their age. So when someone says they are hiding the truth about human origins, the claim lands in a world where secrecy is not unimaginable. But suspicion, once awakened, can become a lens that bends everything passing through it. A missing tablet becomes evidence of suppression. A cautious scholar becomes a gatekeeper. A mistranslation becomes a clue. The absence of proof is no longer a problem. It becomes part of the plot. This is one of the ways extraordinary theories protect themselves. If evidence supports them, it is celebrated. If evidence does not support them, the lack of evidence is explained as concealment. There is also the appeal of forbidden knowledge. Human beings have always been drawn to the idea that reality has an inner chamber, one not open to everyone. Ancient mystery cults, esoteric traditions, alchemy, secret societies, lost civilizations. These are not just fringe decorations on history. They reflect a recurring desire to believe that the visible world is only the surface. The Anunnaki theory fits neatly into that desire. It says the old myths were not primitive explanations. They were encoded records. It says the priests may have known something we forgot. It says the truth was hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone bold enough to read it correctly. There is a thrill in that. A private electricity. To believe you have seen through the official story is to feel, for a moment, less powerless. And the theory also benefits from the emotional strangeness of being human. We are animals, but not comfortably. We build temples, rockets, prisons, lullabies, burial rituals, surveillance networks, and poems. We study the stars while struggling to understand our own appetites. We inherit bodies shaped by deep evolutionary time, yet we live in symbolic worlds so dense that we sometimes forget we are biological creatures at all. This mismatch can feel uncanny. It is easy to look at humanity and think, something happened to us. Evolutionary biology has answers, but they are slow answers. They involve mutation, selection, drift, migration, population bottlenecks, environmental pressures, and long continuities that rarely satisfy the hunger for a single dramatic turning point. Myth, by contrast, understands drama. It gives us a moment, a decision, a maker, a before and after. That is one reason the ancient engineering narrative feels cleaner than the real story. It compresses millions of years into an event. It transforms gradual emergence into intention. Instead of a branching evolutionary tree full of cousins, dead ends, overlaps, and uncertainties, it offers a workshop, a project, a design. The irony is that this modern theory often treats ancient myth with less respect than scholarship does. On the surface, it appears to take the myths seriously by insisting they are records of real events. But in practice, it often strips them of their own symbolic world. The gods become astronauts. The Abzu becomes a facility. Divine craft becomes biotechnology. Ritual language becomes technical vocabulary. The result is not ancient Mesopotamia recovered, but ancient Mesopotamia translated into the anxieties and fascinations of the modern age. And those fascinations are revealing. We live in a time when genetics has become one of the master languages of identity. We speak of code, ancestry, inheritance, mutation, editing. DNA seems to promise a final layer of truth beneath culture and memory. At the same time, gene editing has made biological alteration feel less like fantasy and more like a future already approaching. So when modern audiences hear an old story about beings creating humans, they no longer imagine only clay, breath, and divine command. They imagine laboratories. They imagine chromosomes. They imagine something being cut, fused, inserted, or switched on. The myth has not changed. We have. The same thing happens with ancient images. A figure with wings becomes a visitor from the sky. A symbolic object becomes a device. A god wearing a horned crown becomes a non-human entity in protective equipment. To an Assyriologist, these details belong to the visual and religious language of Mesopotamia. To a modern viewer raised on science fiction, spacecraft, and classified technology, they can appear almost mechanical. The past becomes a mirror, and what we see in it is partly ourselves. There is another reason the theory survives. It offers dignity, oddly enough, even while it seems to diminish us. If humans were engineered by advanced beings, then our existence was not random. We were wanted, or at least useful. We were part of a design, even a harsh design. Humans made as workers for the gods can feel more meaningful than indifference. The universe may be vast and cold, but in this version, someone came here. Someone acted. Someone left marks. That emotional need should not be mocked. It is close to the same need that animates religion, philosophy, and science. The desire to know where we come from and whether our presence matters. But the danger comes when emotional satisfaction is mistaken for evidence. A theory can feel profound and still be unsupported. It can answer a psychological need without answering a historical question. The Anunnaki genetic engineering story persists because it gives shape to unease. It gathers scattered mysteries and makes them point in one direction. But the real record is less obedient. The tablets speak in mythic and theological terms. The fossils show a long, uneven human lineage. The genome preserves evidence of descent, fusion, variation, and inheritance. None of these records is simple. None of them says what the viral version claims, and yet, the refusal to die is itself instructive. It tells us that people are not only looking for facts, they are looking for a story large enough to hold their bewilderment. They want the ancient world to speak directly to the modern one. They want science and myth to meet, not as enemies, but as fragments of one hidden design. And perhaps the reason this theory remains so magnetic is that it imitates a deeper truth. Human origins really are astonishing. Not because a lost tablet secretly described chromosomes, but because clay tablets and chromosomes both belong to us. One records how ancient people imagined creation. The other records the slow physical history of our bodies. The mistake is forcing them to say the same thing. The more careful path is quieter, but richer. It allows myth to be myth without reducing it to a failed science textbook. It allows genetics to be genetics without turning every unknown into a doorway for speculation. It accepts that ancient people were brilliant in ways that do not require modern machinery, and that science can be wondrous without needing a conspiracy behind it. The Anunnaki theory refuses to die because it is not only about aliens, or gods, or chromosomes. It is about the suspicion that humanity is incomplete, that some essential page has been torn from the beginning of our story. In that sense, the theory survives because it speaks to a real feeling. But feelings, however ancient, are not tablets, and longing, however powerful, is not proof. By now, the story has been stripped of some of its theatrical smoke, and what remains is more interesting than a simple yes or no. There is no need to pretend the claim is harmless nonsense, and there is no need to pretend it is secretly proven. The reason it survives is because it rests on three things that are real enough to feel connected. Ancient Mesopotamian myths about the making of humanity, the genuine biological peculiarity of human chromosome 2, and the still unfinished work of understanding the human genome. Each of those subjects contains mystery. Each one invites interpretation. But the question is whether they actually meet, or whether modern imagination has stitched them together after the fact. So let us place the pieces on the table carefully. The first piece is the ancient literature itself. Sumerian and Akkadian traditions do speak about gods, creation, labor, wisdom, clay, blood, divine planning, and the strange boundary between human and God. In texts like the Atrahasis epic, humanity is created to relieve the gods of exhausting work. The language is powerful because it is physical. Humans are not imagined as abstract spirits drifting into existence. They are made from earth, mixed with something divine, formed for a purpose, and bound to the economy of the gods. That is a striking image. It is also not unusual in the world of ancient myth. Across many cultures, the making of humanity is described through familiar materials: clay, breath, blood, bone, water, speech. These are not primitive failed attempts at molecular biology. They are symbolic systems built from the substances ancient people knew best. Clay was not just mud. It was the material of tablets, bricks, vessels, figurines, and cities. To say humans were made from clay was to place them within the same world as houses, temples, and written memory. Blood, meanwhile, carried life, kinship, death, violence, and sacrifice. When myth says human beings are formed from clay and divine blood, it is not quietly spelling out a chromosome map. It is making a claim about status. Humans are low enough to work, but charged with a trace of the sacred. That does not make the texts unimportant. It makes them more human. The second piece is Enki, or Ea, the god most often pulled into modern theories of genetic design. In Mesopotamian tradition, Enki is associated with intelligence, fresh water, craft, magic, and cunning acts that preserve life. It is understandable why later readers turned him into a kind of cosmic scientist. He is the god who knows hidden things. He is linked to the Abzu, the deep freshwater realm beneath the earth. He appears in stories where order is shaped, secrets are managed, and humanity survives danger through divine intervention. But the gap between god of wisdom and craft and director of an ancient genetic laboratory is not a small step. It is a leap across thousands of years of language, culture, and technology. The ancient texts do not describe Enki adjusting chromosomes, extracting DNA, splicing genes, or working with a pre-human species in the language of biology. They describe divine creation through mythic acts. The distinction matters. If every ancient figure associated with wisdom becomes a scientist in disguise, then interpretation stops being interpretation and becomes costume design. The third piece is the Anunnaki. In Mesopotamian sources, the Anunnaki are divine beings, though their roles shift depending on period, text, and context. They are not presented in verified Sumerian scholarship as a race of extraterrestrial miners conducting a biological intervention on early humans. That version belongs to modern ancient astronaut interpretation, a framework built by reading ancient myth through the expectations of 20th century science fiction, space-age speculation, and alternative history. This does not mean every person attracted to the theory is foolish. Often the appeal comes from a sincere instinct. Ancient texts feel too strange, too grand, too full of coded imagery to be treated as mere stories. But not mere story does not automatically mean suppressed technical manual. Myth can preserve social structure, religious anxiety, political ideology, memory of disaster, and deep psychological truths without preserving laboratory procedure. Then there is the biological evidence, and here the ground becomes firmer. Humans have 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans have 48, arranged in 24 pairs. This difference is real. It once posed a question. If humans and other great apes share common ancestry, why do we carry one fewer chromosome pair? The answer, supported by comparative genomics, is chromosome 2 fusion. Scientists have found evidence that two ancestral ape chromosomes fused end to end in the lineage that led to humans. This is not a vague resemblance or a symbolic match. Human chromosome 2 contains remnants of telomeric sequences in an internal location where chromosome ends appear to have joined. It also contains evidence of an inactive second centromere, consistent with two chromosomes becoming one. When compared with corresponding chromosomes in other great apes, the pattern fits evolutionary fusion remarkably well. This is one of those cases where the real science is more elegant than the conspiracy version. It does not require a hidden tablet, a buried laboratory, or a vanished priesthood of geneticists. It requires inheritance, mutation, reproductive success, and deep time. The fusion did not need to happen in every early human at once. A chromosomal change can arise in an individual, persist if it does not prevent reproduction, and spread through a population over generations under the complicated pressures of ancestry and breeding. Does chromosome 2 fusion prove common ancestry by itself? Science rarely rests on a single pillar, but it fits within a much larger structure. Fossil evidence, comparative anatomy, shared genetic markers, endogenous retroviral insertions, and patterns of DNA similarity across primates. The fusion is not an isolated oddity begging for supernatural or extraterrestrial explanation. It is a strong and specific clue within a broader evolutionary picture. Could an advanced intelligence have caused it deliberately? In the most abstract sense, almost anything can be proposed. But evidence is not measured by whether a scenario can be imagined. It is measured by whether the scenario leaves traces that distinguish it from known natural processes. A deliberate genetic engineering project on the scale claimed by the Anunnaki theory would be expected to leave unusual signatures, abrupt genetic discontinuities, engineered insertions with identifiable design patterns, technological artifacts, clear ancient descriptions of biological procedure, or archaeological context linking human alteration to an external intervention. We do not have that. What we have is a fusion pattern that looks like natural chromosomal evolution. The junk DNA argument also needs care. For years, the phrase was misunderstood by the public as meaning useless genetic trash. In reality, the history of the term is more complicated. Some non-coding DNA has regulatory, structural, or developmental functions. Some sequences affect when and where genes are expressed. Some parts of the genome remain poorly understood. But scientific uncertainty is not an empty chamber waiting to be filled with aliens, gods, or secret interventions. This is a common mistake in fringe interpretations. A gap in knowledge becomes a doorway, and then anything can be walked through it. But not all unknowns are equal. We do not yet fully understand every function of non-coding DNA is a very different statement from ancient beings inserted hidden code into human beings. The first is a research problem. The second is a historical and biological claim requiring evidence of its own. The missing tablet is therefore not a minor inconvenience. It is central. No verified Sumerian or Akkadian tablet has been shown to describe DNA, chromosomes, gene-splicing, Homo erectus, or a deliberate reduction from 24 chromosome pairs to 23. Claims that such a tablet exists usually depend on loose paraphrase, modern reinterpretation, or statements passed from one secondary source to another until they sound older than they are. The ancient world left us many broken texts, yes. Many gaps remain. But absence should not be turned into evidence simply because the missing object would be convenient. What the evidence really says is narrower, but stronger. Mesopotamian myths tell us that ancient people imagined humanity as a created workforce, formed from earthly and divine substance, obligated to serve the gods through labor, ritual, and civilization. Evolutionary genetics tells us that human chromosome 2 preserves evidence of an ancestral fusion event in our lineage. Modern genomics tells us that DNA is more complex than early popular language suggested, and that the boundary between coding, regulation, structure, and apparent genetic debris is still being refined. These are all meaningful truths. They do not, however, combine into proof of an Enki-led genetic engineering project. The more honest conclusion is also the more revealing one. The theory works by placing modern anxieties inside ancient stories. It takes the old fear that humans were made to serve, joins it to the modern knowledge that our bodies carry an evolutionary record, and wraps both in the suspicion that official history is hiding something. That combination is powerful because it feels emotionally coherent, even when the evidence does not hold. And perhaps that is why the legend endures. It offers a single dramatic explanation for things that are otherwise slow, layered, and difficult. Labor, consciousness, evolution, suffering, intelligence, and the strange fact that we are animals who can read the code of our own bodies. But the real record asks for patience. The tablets speak in myth. The fossils speak in fragments. The genome speaks in patterns older than language. None of them say exactly what the viral claim says they say. And that, in the end, is not a disappointment. It is the beginning of a better mystery. In the end, the strangest thing about the story is not that an ancient tablet failed to prove modern genetics. It is that the rumor felt believable to so many people. A hidden record from Sumer, a god of wisdom beneath the waters. Human beings altered for labor, a missing chromosome pair. A forbidden explanation sealed inside clay, waiting thousands of years for modern science to decode it. The pieces seem, at first glance, to lean toward one another. Myth and genome, temple and laboratory, creation story and evolutionary scar. But when we slow down, the pieces do not lock together. They only resemble a pattern from a distance. What we can say with confidence is quieter, but far more durable. Mesopotamian texts do speak of gods shaping humanity. They do speak of clay, blood, toil, divine service, and the burden of work. They preserve a world where human life was understood through obligation, to the fields, to the city, to the temple, to powers imagined as older and greater than kings. And human genetics does carry evidence of deep ancestry. Chromosome 2 really does bear the mark of an ancient fusion. Our bodies really do preserve traces of events that happened before cities, before writing, before any priest pressed a reed stylus into wet clay. But there is no verified tablet that describes DNA. No known Sumerian text that names chromosomes. No ancient medical record of gene-splicing, hybridization with Homo erectus, or a deliberate reduction from 48 chromosomes to 46. Those claims belong not to the archives of Mesopotamia, but to the modern imagination. An imagination trained by science fiction, suspicious of official answers, and drawn to the possibility that the human story has been edited. Still, it would be a mistake to treat the myth as worthless simply because it is not biology. Ancient creation stories were not primitive lab reports. They were attempts to make life intelligible. They asked why people suffer, why labor never ends, why intelligence feels like both a gift and a punishment, why human beings can build cities and still fear hunger, disease, flood, and death. These were not small questions. They are not small now. The people of ancient Mesopotamia lived in a landscape where survival depended on water, controlled by canals, grain measured by administrators, and gods honored through temples that were also economic engines. In that world, to say that humans were created to work for the gods was not merely a fantasy. It was a way of describing the structure of existence. Work was sacred, exhausting, unavoidable. The gods themselves, in the myths, had once rebelled against labor. Humanity enters the story as the solution to divine fatigue. That detail matters, because it tells us that the creation of humans was not imagined as a clean miracle. It was imagined as a compromise. And perhaps that is why these myths still cling to us. They do not present humanity as perfect. They do not say we were made in comfort, or innocence, or clarity. They suggest that to be human is to carry mixed origins, earth and divinity, clay and blood, weakness and cleverness, obedience and rebellion. Modern genetics tells a different kind of story, but not a less astonishing one. It tells us that we are not separate from life, but continuous with it. that our bodies are archives of older forms, that the boundary between human and animal is not a wall, but a long, branching path. It tells us that one chromosome can preserve the memory of a fusion so ancient that no human eye witnessed it, and yet every human body carries its result. There is no need to force Enki into a laboratory for that to be wondrous. The real secret we inherited may be this. Human beings have always explained themselves through the strongest language available. Once that language was myth, gods, clay, waters beneath the earth, divine breath, sacred labor. Today, it is genetics, chromosomes, mutations, fossils, comparative genomes, deep time. Both languages, at their best, are attempts to stand before the same abyss and speak honestly. The danger comes when we confuse them. When myth is flattened into bad science, it loses its poetry. When science is bent into prophecy, it loses its discipline. And when uncertainty becomes a blank space where any claim can be placed, we no longer uncover hidden history. We manufacture it. The Sumerians did leave us a secret, but not the one promised by viral fragments and missing tablets. They left us evidence of a civilization thinking intensely about why humans exist at all, why we work, why we serve, why we suffer, why we dream of creators who are powerful, flawed, and strangely familiar. And science has left us another inheritance. The knowledge that our origins are deeper, older, and more intricate than any single myth could contain. So perhaps the question is not whether a god once engineered us in secret. Perhaps the better question is why, after all these centuries, we still feel unfinished enough to believe it. Not everything hidden is a conspiracy. Some things are simply buried deep, in language, in bone, in the genome, and in the oldest stories we still have not finished telling.